Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode. Oh my god, I completely forgot the episode number. I did this again. Um, okay, yeah, it's 238. I knew it was 238, but do you know what confused me? Is that earlier on today I did my Boruto episode review, and it was also episode 238. So I was thinking, like, am I just saying the name of the episode I just reviewed, or is this the name of the episode of the podcast? But they are actually the same number.
That's too funny.
Okay, 238, 238. Okay. Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 238 of our regular shows, and we're recording this on February 27th, 2022. It's the official podcast for the fan site Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com, and I'm your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on this show, we're going to be going over some news, and then we'll be giving sort of our first thoughts on the Avatar Legends role-playing game core book PDF that has just started its rollout. Both of us do have our PDFs, but we have only had them a few days, and there's a lot of information to get through. We will probably come back and do a more like in-depth podcast. For now, it's just going to be more of kind of initial reactions. We'll go as in-depth as we can, but we're not going to make this like the complete review here because there's so much to get through. So we'll start with the news, and I think we have to start with sort of the place we expected news to be that we didn't get news from, and that is the Viacom, or I guess Paramount Investors event now, because I suppose the rebrand, new name is probably the main takeaway from that. But it obviously is a year on from the announcement of Avatar Studios. This was the event last year. We got Avatar Studios. We haven't really had an official update on Avatar Studios since, so this felt like the place we were going to get it. In the build-up to the event, there was actually a few things that happened that made you believe Avatar news was going to happen. One, a advert for kind of Paramount came out that included like new animation of Aang with like Dora and all these other Nickelodeon characters, so the timing on that felt kind of important. The social media accounts for Avatar all updated their like banner images to now include the sort of Paramount tagline on it, and they hadn't really done an update like that in a long time. But then the event actually happened, like all 2.5 hours of it. A lot of people were watching it, and Avatar didn't even get mentioned. I don't even think there was a single visual for Avatar shown, even in like the background, as this is also on our streaming platform. So it was a kind of disappointing event. Obviously, nothing was promised, but it was a bit like, if they're not going to do anything here, where are they going to do it? And we're left in this kind of weird spot of like, I guess Avatar Studios is a long way away. But Greg, what were your thoughts on this? We had minor expectations. We had our expectations low. We'll get minimal information. We didn't even get that. What were your thoughts on what happened?
Yeah, no, the expectations were quite low. Even from the get-go, even from before when we're talking about it, it was like there could be something, but there's also a really high chance that there might not be anything at all. And it definitely did turn out to be that way in the end, throughout the whole sort of event, I guess you could say. Even when they did get near towards like the section where they could potentially, talk about Avatar or just their new upcoming shows. And they did talk about, plenty of other, new shows that are up and coming, or that they have plans and stuff like that. But no, Avatar was not on the list, for them to actually speak about, which I guess really does go to, what you were earlier saying, that it really just is quite a bit too early, which of course leads back to sort of the original announcement and, sort of the idea behind that being, announced at that point in time, and it being so, I guess, really, really fresh in terms of, the agreements and contracts. And not to say that we haven't got any sort of like sideways sort of news about, Avatar Studios, but that's more of, people on the fans sort of reaching out and sort of finding things on their own rather than sort of it being sort of announced in any sort of like, I guess, official capacity, per what you would say. And, I guess, you know, these things, they do take, a time and a process. And, it has been mentioned in other forms that, this isn't something that's going to be quick, and it will be quite a ways away, which I guess, this is just sort of how it's sort of processing at this point now. But I guess for those of us who were, thinking that maybe there could be something, if you were happen to watch this event, it definitely was, I guess, a bit of a letdown from that regard, for sure.
Yeah, and there was definitely a little bit of that, of like, kind of the discussion about like, is it okay to be disappointed about this, given that nothing was promised? But then the discussion kind of went a few different directions, and my point in the end was sort of that, like, I don't think this is anything about sort of like production. Like, no one wants them to rush things, and I don't think anyone is asking them to rush any of their project. It's, to me, more of a kind of communication issue of like, we don't even know where new Avatar Studios information is going to come from, in that the social media accounts don't really feel like the place they do that, unless they make a big change sometime soon. So these events, because they're more investor business focused, feel like some of the only places we can get them, just because like Comic-Cons haven't been doing anything in a long time. Maybe that will change. We'll see what happens. But it's just, even if you didn't have anything new to show, even an update just to sort of reiterate, but with sort of new estimates, or just say something new, would be nice to get. Even if like you literally have nothing and are just telling us you're going to be waiting a few more years, it's nice to have the sort of early 2022 update to say you're going to be waiting quite a while. Otherwise, the expectations just kind of go all over the place, because we're still running off kind of date estimates from the event last year, which suggested that there'd be Avatar content within the first 2 years, which seems kind of like an impossibility at this point. But we don't have any like new dates to update those numbers to. That's kind of more of the problem at the moment. The other thing that added to this was actually, I think it was the day before the investors event, Avatar News got some exclusive information of a couple new people who are members of Team Avatar Studios. So Christy Seng joining Avatar Studios as an executive art director, William New joining as an art director, Steve On as the head of storyboard on Avatar Studios, and then we already knew Lauren Montgomery was on as a director, but his news seemed to confirm here specifically that Lauren Montgomery is directing the Avatar Studios movie. So if that is correct, which probably is the case, that is the first like piece of news that really acknowledges the movie in kind of quite a while, that actually makes it really clear that the movie is going into production and it has a director attached to it. So this was sort of another thing that made us believe we might get news that, oh, well, if they've assigned the director now, they can at least announce it, I guess. We didn't really get that, but this is something. All of these other three people, like all four of them actually, worked previously on Korra, and Lauren Montgomery, of course, worked on Avatar. So them returning in sort of higher positions here is actually very cool to see, that like the team is sort of being reassembled, but there's also going to be new people. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this? Some of the new sort of, I suppose, high up art people, and the movie gets a director.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess, looking at it from that perspective, it does, I guess sort of tries to sort of, I guess, key you in that maybe, more things are moving around. But I think from hearing, the positions of the people that are being in place now, and them being, more higher up, I guess the sort of positions or the chain of what would be, producing the movie or any sort of project that Avatar Studios is working on, is more of the sort of, I guess, sort of initial or starting people that you would typically start, your production with, which in my mind leads to me, more so to believe that, it is really, really just sort of getting started if they're, implementing these people at this point in time. Now, that's not to say that they haven't, already been on the project for quite a while, and we're just sort of getting news of this now, and, however that sort of goes. But, it is sort of more so early stages. And I guess, it depends on the certain projects because sometimes, projects will get announced, as soon as they have a director and that'll be it. And then, it's just off to the races versus other ones definitely take a lot longer time to actually, get out into like the zeitgeist that, stuff has actually happened. It kind of depends on popularity. And obviously Avatar has a huge popularity behind it. So, it kind of leads you to think that stuff would be announced maybe earlier than sooner because as far as we know, they have like a really strong backing from Paramount and everything like that. But it seems like, at least as of now, they're playing it, pretty close in terms of when they'll actually officially announce anything. And, considering, I guess we don't know potentially, like you were saying, like the official channels that would come out from, we're sort of, looking all over the place, which I guess doesn't sort of help in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose one thing with Laura Montgomery that I did see, just because Avatar News is quite popular on Twitter, so there was a lot of comments on the Laura Montgomery post, because he mentioned in it, of course, that she was on both ATLA, Korra, and was the showrunner on Voltron. And that show seems to, since it's ended, have developed a kind of very bad reputation. So people are worried about sort of the movie because she's the director. Whereas I'm kind of like, I covered Voltron very heavily. We did on the podcast, me and my channel.
Yeah.
And I'm like, did we watch the same show? Like, I get it wasn't perfect, but I don't get this idea that like she directed this terrible show or something like that. Now I will acknowledge, I think we've discussed this a few times, that the fandom for Voltron seemed kind of wild at times with some of the stuff that went on, and so I think some of the fan criticism is probably overblown. I don't really have too much of a problem. I think the sort of Korra influence on Voltron turned like the Voltron franchise, which a lot of people would have had no interest in before this, into something that was sort of a Avatar-esque show in terms of like characterization and plot, and I thought that was really good. So what are your thoughts on that? Just the whole, like, do you think Laura Montgomery will be a good director for this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I guess, from that perspective, I see sort of the idea where some people would go from for that. But I think, I guess it really depends on the project. And, there's like anything else, it's not just one person that's running a project. There's, multiple people and, the original creators are there as well. So even if they're not, in the day-to-day minutia, they're still there in, whatever advisory capacity you want to consider them in. So, that's something to, I guess, keep in mind as well. So I don't know. For me, I mean, I don't know. I mean, yeah, there are definitely parts of Voltron that, weren't sort of the best, but you could say that about any show, including Avatar and Korra. So I don't know. I think that maybe a bit more on the sort of harsher side of the criticism, but I guess, like anything else, you definitely have to sort of wait and see how it sort of turns out. But it doesn't scare me from the onset of having her as a director. And, she's done many other things even before Avatar stuff that, also, puts her in the position to be in that position in the first place. So it's not like that's her only thing to go by, if that's what you're trying to base things on.
Yeah, I think we discussed this when Avatar Studio was announced, that Mike and Brian are not going to be able to play the same role they played on Avatar and Korra on potentially 5-6 different projects running at the same time. It's just impossible. So they need to bring in some of the high up people in even higher positions on these shows to be like showrunners for this project. They'll still like touch a little bit of everything, but more from, I suppose, like a supervisory position. So, I think this is fine. I never really had that many heavy criticisms with Voltron, so I think this is perfectly fine. But yeah, that's what there is to say there. I suppose while we're here, before we get into the other sort of different piece of news that Avatar News kind of got an exclusive on, he sort of teased a few things. One of them is in the post about the video games, which we'll talk about next, saying that like one last thing I can more or less confirm is that the reason there was no Avatar Studios movie or show information at the Paramount event this week is because it was just too early. But I think it was literally just a bit too early. That's all I'll say for now. And then I think in one of his other tweets he had mentioned that like he believes that the information right now is saying that they actually might say something at San Diego Comic-Con. Now, again, no source as such for any of this, just sort of like whatever people he has giving him this information is suggesting this. So that is kind of interesting. And then I suppose we also have to add on to this that I think it was the people running the official Avatar social media accounts for Instagram did reply to a few people in the aftermath of the no news at the event, of people saying like, hey, what about Avatar Studios? There's nothing said at this event. And they said like, oh, like they didn't say anything like soon or stay tuned. They're like, we haven't forgotten. Like we still remember, basically. And it feels like a weird thing for the social media channels to say if there's nothing in the planning or anything like that. So we're just in this weird situation where either this is just us wanting news straight away, or they actually do have something planned for the reveal, and it's not going to be as far off as we think it will be. So what are your thoughts on some of this stuff, this kind of insider stuff suggesting that like this event maybe was just like a couple of months too early?
I mean, that'll be awesome if that's true for sure. No, I guess I don't know. It's interesting to see, that being said, which I guess, they had the insider scoop on that one, so they would know more so than anyone else. So no, if that's true, I'll definitely be looking forward to it. So yeah, I guess, if it's San Diego Comic-Con, that information gets, let out, or I don't know, maybe NYCC if they want to do it later on, or even if it's just on their own, which, through whatever normal sources they would do, like IGN or whatever, that would be cool to have it come out that sort of way.
Yeah, or just do your own Avatar Studios streaming events. Like it works for like most video game companies. They didn't do their own events addressing their fandom directly. I think they have the capacity to do that if they want, and it will work. But the thing with the Comic-Con, obviously, is that at least there we'll know, because the panel will get it announced at the latest, probably like 2 weeks ahead of the convention. We'll know the name of that panel, and it'll have some description. And if there is going to be an announcement, I think it will be kind of clear from what that description and title says. Because I doubt they'll suddenly announce Avatar Studios stuff if it's a Braving the Elements panel, and if it's a publishing panel, the same thing. But if it's like Avatar Studios panel, Mike and Brian are going to be there, actually we're on this time, like it's actually happening. So with this event, of course, it was so broad, just for like all of Paramount, there was never going to be that specific information ahead of time. With this, we'll know. So there is that, and we could know up to like maybe even a month beforehand as well. So something to look out for. But the other exclusive Avatar Studio had, like I mentioned, was about video games. So again, there's no source given here, but here's what it says. I have some huge news for you today. An ATLA console RPG and an Avatar MMO RPG are in development at undisclosed game studios in collaboration with Paramount's Avatar Studios. Not just that, but these are just 2 games of at least 4 in development, including the previously announced Square Enix mobile game announced last year. And there's obviously at least 1 other game. One of the only really specific pieces of information here is that at least one, or maybe all of these games, will feature the original ATLA characters recast with Asian and Indigenous voice actors, voice matches of the originals. He also says these have been in development in secret for a pretty long time now, and they're coming much sooner than you think. That's all I can say. The first one is a vague descriptor. I think most of this stuff afterwards is kind of mainly his own opinion on the things rather than like the source information. But that's what we're getting here. The first, I suppose, clear-cut information that I suppose proper video games for Avatar are in development. And this one actually got out there. I saw some of the bigger video game forums were posting about this as well. I believe the developer on a big fan Avatar game also said something about this, that adding sort of like credence to the fact that yeah, this is the case. They were also aware of development being in place for a while now. So yeah, there's not too much to say in that. Like, this feels rather like obvious. Avatar was eventually going to get a game, but to find out that there are like 4 official games in development, 1 mobile game at least, and then what looks like 2 like big games, is kind of crazy. So we'll see what happens here, because RPG could be a variety of things. The MMORPG could also be a variety of things. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this? Some video game stuff happening.
Yeah, I mean, I guess along the lines of what you're saying, it did seem like it would be, assuming that the popularity and everything, kept up as much as it has been, that it would be an eventuality. Now, that doesn't mean that it's automatic, but it definitely seems with this news, if, the source is right and everything, that they are definitely coming. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting that, they're saying that it has been developed for or in development for a while now, which I don't know. It makes me think sort of like some of the earlier thoughts that we had of, when things do come out, they're really trying to sort of like sync them all up this time rather than, what has been happening in the past where like some merchandise has come out too late and it just doesn't do any well, or, the show has like a long break and then, there's nothing to sort of follow up with it. It seems like this would more lead along the lines of things actually like coming out as like one big bang and we get a whole bunch of stuff at one time and we don't know what to do because there's all this sort of content, which if that is the case, that would definitely be really cool. Like, it's better to have stuff than not have everything. So I wonder if that's really sort of how they're planning with this, and if this is true, it really does just add I guess precedence to sort of like them really putting a lot of money and time and effort behind the Avatar verse in general, which is cool to see. Since even if we don't have much news about when the movie's coming out or anything like that, it seems like things are moving behind the scenes. So I guess little things like these, assuming everything is on the up and up, is definitely really cool to hear about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's definitely cool. Again, like you say, it means that there's a lot of stuff that we're sort of waiting on announcements for, like next novel, next sort of batch of comics, sort of video game announcements now, Avatar Studios announcements. It feels like, yeah, if hopefully we're building up to just an announcement that just like opens the floodgates and it's like, okay, from the second half of 2022 onwards, we are actually seeing some of the results of Avatar Studios and everything sort of working together. But again, we're waiting for the start of this to actually happen, because like nothing new has really been announced in quite a while. Even merchandise stuff so far in the year hasn't really been particularly heavy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. So we'll move on from this, because again, there's not a lot to speculate right now about the games because it's kind of unclear exactly what that means, in that, like, by Avatar console RPG, does that mean it's going to be like sort of an Avatar sort of open world game, or like Avatar Skyrim style thing, or would that be more like what the MMO is? We just be having just the general video game speculation that we've had for ages. So we'll move on to the next few final pieces of news here. So first up, the one piece of for action figure news we've had in quite a while. We have a sort of official, final, like in hand, real images of the Best Action Zuko figure. So we had seen this one announced a while ago, but only seen a render, and now we have a look at the finalized figure. It's pretty interesting. I think overall it looks good, but I think it's another figure where the head has not been done quite right. Zuko's hair seems like the way I describe it is like it's cut too short compared to like what his actual hairstyle is, and it makes it look kind of odd. The other odd thing about it is that this Book 3 Zuko figure comes with an alternate head that is basically like middle of Book 2 Zuko with the really short hair. The hair that he is never like shown with while wearing this outfit. So it's this really random head swap thing that doesn't really like accomplish anything as such, other than to sort of just be different. And it's weird because it is a full head. It's not like a face swap thing, so it doesn't seem like you can just like switch out the different faces with the different hairstyles. It's no, they're tied together. Otherwise, it seems like this Zuko comes with some good stuff. Like has the swords, the holder for the swords, two fireballs, and these ones look relatively articulated despite being kind of small. But some weird decisions on this one, I think. But what are your thoughts on the Zuko?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that the sort of hairstyle or the head swap does seem a bit odd. I mean, overall, the figure doesn't feel that bad. Like the proportions seem good. Like it seems like it's adequately like posable. Like you can do a couple different poses, which they show off on the Instagram post for it. So from that perspective, it seems fine. But yeah, the head sculpt, I don't know, maybe it's the pictures and the angles that they have it at or something else, but the hair itself definitely does seem a bit sort of cut low. I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, it's always like a hard thing to like translate it from like, the animated show into the actual sort of like real physical sort of sculpt of it. So there's always like some, I guess, sort of like translation that they have to do there in terms of getting it. But I don't know. It definitely does feel a little bit odd in the images that they currently have for it right now. I actually think the head feels better to me with the short hair, even if the short hair actually feels odd in terms of the outfit that Zuko has. So I don't know. That's just interesting.
Because it's weird in that like you kind of think like, oh, that's the head for the book two Zuko when they released the book two Zuko, but then that figure would already come with this head surely, so you just have this extra head that's almost like needless unless they do different expressions. The what really makes it stand out is if you look at the sort of promo image of Zuko on the front of the packaging, like you can see sort of the sort of spikiness of his hair. That's the length of his hair, and then you look at the pictures where it has that hairstyle, and it just seems like this is a different haircut. And then it really emphasizes, I suppose, how smooth the plastic is on the top compared to like the spikiness of his hair. There needs to be some detail on it. Which is sort of what the McFarlane stuff has been doing, has been like adding in that detail of like, this is what the fabric will be like. The hair actually has more strands to it than you've sort of ever seen before. But, I'm excited to see the rest of these because these seem to be doing the first like Jet figure is part of this wave as well. They have another Katara here. So I'm excited to see the rest of these to see how they turn out. Because like I said, there hasn't really been much figure news. Like we're still waiting on like the next Diamond statue to get announced, the next wave of Diamond Select, the next Avatar McFarlane wave at the bigger scale. Waiting to see if McFarlane do Korra figures this year. See kind of if anyone puts out Korra merchandise for the anniversary year. Because like I doubt at this point we're going to have anything for April really. Because it feels like, obviously, as we'll get into here, like the book that was meant to be out for April is delayed way past April. So we don't really have much for that specific date. But for the year, do we even have much for Korra? And that's maybe where some of the issues come in. So we'll get to that. But yeah, the last piece of news before we get into the PDF discussion is more comic delays. And it's more comic delays for the same books. I think when we did the last podcast, we also talked about Patterns in Time and the Chibi comic have both been delayed. Well, it's happened again. And it's actually quite big delays this time. Patterns in Time is now coming out July 27th. And then the Chibi comic is now coming out July 20th. So I think this is delay 4 for the Patterns in Time. And it's delay number 7 for the Chibi comic. What's very interesting, especially with the Chibi comic, is that I think as of today, it's exactly a year since this book was announced. And it's like also a year that the book has been delayed. So it effectively had this date just last year as its initial release date. So it's weird how that's worked out. That this book has been just incredibly delayed. That it was like July last year, initial release date. And then we're still talking about July, but this year is the release date. Will it ever come out? Who knows what it is? It's getting confusing at this point, with so many rapid fire delays. I guess we sort of know why they're happening, but it also feels really extreme, and I think, as people have pointed out, this doesn't really seem to be something that affects a lot of Dark Horse's like other franchise or other books, but Avatar specifically keeps getting like constant release date changes, which makes it really stand out. Um, any thoughts on this recent batches of delays? Do you think these might be the last delays, or will we get more?
I really don't know at this point. I mean, it's quite unfortunate because I know, some people really were looking forward to these, and to have it be pushed back so far after original announcement. I mean, yeah, there are, definitely various reasons why it's happening, and some of them can't sort of be avoided. But I don't know. This almost makes it seem like it should have been like along with sort of like the Avatar Studios announcement, where it just shouldn't have been mentioned, when it was mentioned so long ago.
Yeah, it's just frustrating, because these aren't even like the most exciting books, and that's the other thing is here is that like we are suddenly developing like higher and higher expectations for these things when they are clearly not the books that we're sort of really wanting and waiting for. In that, like, we've gone from proper Avatar comic trilogies advancing the story to one shots which are nice but are just sort of, giving you a little bit extra on characters, to now, a chibi comic is the only Avatar book for the year. The only Korra book in the anniversary year is a book that's going to be mostly reprints, and then we have no clue about how good or not the stories are going to be. And if you look at the previous book like this, Team Avatar Tales, the quality of the new stories in that book was not super high. So you'd really hope that they deliver on this new one here, because otherwise, the free comic is probably the most exciting new book of the year, just because there's actually some expectations, because last year's free comic really delivered with both stories. So they're doing the same thing this year, Avatar and Korra. That might be the best book of the year. Who knows? But yeah, we have to wait until May for the next comic, which is Free Comic Book Day in May. But that's just where we are. So that is the news, and we'll move from there into some thoughts on the Avatar Legends role-playing game PDF of the core book. I think before we get into the book itself, we probably have to talk about the rollout and how they actually did this, because it created a bit of frustration for the first few couple of days, because they put out a post, it was last month, mentioning that, okay, we are planning to start the rollout of this on the 21st. And we'll put up a post describing the process and so on. So don't worry, if you don't get yours on the 21st. They put up that post, but weirdly, they never say in that post when exactly the rollout of these PDFs is starting. They go into a lot of detail on like everything else, except making it clear when, or really when not, the rollout actually is going to start. And then a few things happened that made it seem like they maybe lost control of the situation a bit, in that there was suddenly revealed that like, oh, we kind of didn't realize we had set the date on like a holiday in the US, so it's not going to roll out on the 21st, just this post. Then nothing happened on the 22nd, and they're like, well, they have to like do their kind of digital rights management stuff on all the PDFs. So that's what's taking up the time there. And then it became clear that like, oh, it's all on DriveThruRPG's end, what's happening here. And I think for like the first 3 days, no one actually got the PDF. And then it only actually started to roll out on like the Thursday this week. That's when I got mine, and I think I was part of the first batch. So that was good for me, but it left a lot of people kind of confused as to what was actually happening here. They're lucky they have a very like patient group of fans, and on the Discord they seem to moderate things quite heavily to avoid criticism, because this seemed kind of bad with the communication initially. But Greg, what were your thoughts on like how the kind of rollout kind of went? Seems to be going fine now, but they didn't communicate very well about how late in the game the process would actually start.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely saw a lot of those comments about people wondering sort of how they were going to get it through, what process were actually going to be delivered, how it was actually going through like a third party site, how it would have, like some DRM uh, on the actual PDF itself and, all of that sort of process. So I think there probably would have been, I don't know, maybe there could have been like a clearer post on that or more direct communication through like I don't know, through like their newsletters and stuff like that for more people to actually get the information, other than, people jumping on the Discord or just replying to the last post on the Kickstarter, which I saw some people doing as well. So I don't know, they definitely could have probably been handled a little bit better. They did, eventually mention how it was going to be staggered and all of that, and it's going to go out in waves. So I don't know how many, end waves they're going to do or if everyone already has gotten it by now. So I don't know, but no, it seems like it is more or less rolling out now. But yeah.
Yeah, once it started, it seems like it's gone smoothly. I haven't kept too much track of it, but I haven't seen too much criticism outside of maybe a handful of people being like, "Oh, I haven't got mine yet." But it seems like it's relatively okay. I guess on like in like 2 days we'll find out how many people are like, "Oh, they didn't get theirs within the window," because they're saying everyone should have it by the end of the month, and obviously we're right there basically. Um, but we have it now. Now, interestingly, they did say in the post, this is not the final version of the book, but it's basically like 98% of the book. They said there probably is a few typos in here, and the images for sort of the start of chapter pages are not in there. It's just blank blue, I think, for all of them. So
Oh yeah.
we have to wait to see what those are, and I think they will just update the PDF. I can't remember. Did they say how the whole getting the new version of the book is going to work? Will it just be a separate email?
Yeah.
I'm not sure because I think it still is ultimately tied through DriveThru RPG, and I think they said they can just change the file and you can get it or something. But either way, I don't think a ton of information is going to change. I think I saw a few people in the Discord mentioning that like in some of the like sections on the gameplay mechanics, some of it's a bit weird in terms of like the logic of it, but I don't think there's a lot of issue with like the lore section which we're going to cover here. So that should all be, I think, pretty fine. I think in my read through, I think I saw one typo, and it was literally just like there should be a space between like and the start of the next word. I didn't really see any like wrong spellings or anything like that. And from a lore perspective, it all seemed accurate to me, at least. Some of it may read a little weirdly, but it's just kind of maybe framed a little bit slightly differently, but I think it all makes sense. But I suppose, what was just your like initial thoughts reading through it in terms of the way they lay out this settings section, how much there is, and so on?
Yeah, no, I think overall the layout for it, for not being someone who's like well versed in these type of I guess sort of core books for these type of games, seemed pretty well to me. Like it, it clearly described how each of the sections were going to be broken down, sort of how it actually plays into the game, and how the characters are interacting with the world, and sort of for those playing the game, sort of like what missions you can go on based off of the characters, and sort of framing it per the specific errors that they're actually sort of have in the book right now. So no, for me, all of that was laid out pretty clear, and I could understand it, and a lot of it just sort of read as like sort of jumping parts for the stories, which of course that's the whole point of it, with possible sort of outcomes that could happen from it. So no, for reading this through for my first time, and taking a couple notes here and there on different sections, and sort of the characters that from the books or the comics, I think that was really cool to see. And they do reference directly the comics and the books in the different sections here for various different characters or certain events that actually happen as well. So, they definitely took the time to make sure that it all sort of plays well, at least as far as I can tell, with everything that has come out so far. And any of the new stuff that they have added, sort of plays well with everything that I've seen so far. So I haven't, to me at least, there hasn't been anything, that really sort of like popped out as me as like this doesn't, make sense at all. Some of it is new and is interesting and cool and stuff like that, which could be hit or miss, I guess, depending on your personal preferences. But in terms of just reading through it as more of a, I guess, sort of a story or a lore aspect, which was my angle, of course. It worked pretty cool.
Yeah, like with me, my main thoughts were like, whoa, this is way more like pages, and on those pages, way more text than I expected. Like, not all of it is new, but it does take a long time to just read through it because it presents it, I think, quite nicely in terms of like sort of general lore on the era, introduction, and then has like a sort of general section on each era, and then goes into sort of like theme, important events, important characters. So it breaks it down quite nicely. There's a bit of repetition at times where it's like, here's what the Airbenders are doing during this era in general. Thematically, this is what the Airbenders are doing and how it relates to this. This character is the key character in this theme playing out. So you kind of read the same maybe paragraph 5 or 6 times during each section, but usually they add in an extra little bit during each of those kind of parts. So I did like that. You can tell the Roku section is like packed with new information, and that basically the other 4 eras or 5 eras don't really have that much extra new stuff like at all. And it does sort of stand out that you can sort of tell that, okay, here's all this stuff that we were just learning about for the first time, versus a lot of the setup stuff from especially say the Aang and Korra era are literally just sort of like the comics, because the comic explores this theme. This is one of the themes you can explore in one of your games. So it sort of stands out like that. There's a section right at the start. It's interesting. They do call it like the Avatar verse is like sort of made like an official term here.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. So I guess that is something to start using, which is kind of nice. Beyond that, like the initial section right at the start goes through the history. Like it has like a pretty much straight up recap of like Wan's era, pretty much like exactly how it happens. I pointed this out in the video I made on like this initial section that like I did like the clarification. The 2 primordial spirits, Rava and Vatu, pierce the barrier separating the 2 realms, allowing spirits to enter the physical world. Because that was always a bit of a weird one in that I think it's Vatu alone who basically says that line in Korra, but it's almost like in the background in the middle of a fight and you kind of almost forget he said it. And then I think the art book clarified it. So it's nice to have just the idea that, okay, yeah, the reason that any travel between the 2, any contact between the 2 beings is possible is because of these 2 spirits. Other than that, there's not a lot of new stuff in the Wan era. And it's in these sort of like transition parts where you do notice that, okay, they were allowed to add new stuff to the Roku era because they had to, but there was no sense of like, oh, let's just throw in some stuff about this new thing. It's very kind of, it feels very strict in that you really notice that there's no transition material from Wan's era to the start of Kyoshi's era, like at all in this book, which is kind of noticeable. I think one of the Earth Kingdom sections gives you like a very rough breakdown, which I think is basically what everyone always says about it, that the Earth Kingdom's early history is filled with war between various groups vying for power, as seen in the time of Avatar 1, when settlers first fought for control over the territories that eventually became the Earth Kingdom. So it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Not super in-depth, but it's the only mention of that sort of transition period. And that's would maybe be my one criticism, is just that, like, I wish there was a little bit more added to fill in gaps like that. But what are your thoughts on that kind of like initial section? Were you okay with them pretty much just doing the beginnings backstory, or did you want a bit more?
I mean, no, more is always nice, of course, but in terms of how they actually went through and breaking it down, it did read really well. Like they did, I think, for almost all of it, they did a really good job in terms of like basically like transcribing the events in sort of this sort of more text, almost sort of like encyclopedia type of format, which I think they did a really good job on that. And yeah, it definitely would have been cool to have, a bit more there in terms of like filling in the gaps, but in terms of what they're going for in terms of this whole overall game that they're making, I guess it's okay that they weren't able to add too much in there. And like you mentioned before, like if you've been following the show for a while or anything like that, then you can tell where there's new stuff versus there isn't anything really added, and you can specifically call out what book or what comic or what episodes or whatever certain parts are from, which I guess it's a nice sort of callback, because I mean that's the whole reason for this game, is that you're basing it off the show. But it does stand out, I guess, for better or worse.
Hmm. Yeah, I think one of the cooler sections of the book that is really cool to have is the map that's sort of annotated with key areas. Um,
Yes.
it has a few new place names related to some of the new eras, and actually some of the eras that we already know about. So there's stuff like Chenbao, which is a part of the Earth Kingdom right up in the north, basically the closest part of the Earth Kingdom to the Northern Water Tribe, and they go into a whole story about why this is a key point in Roku's era. Effectively, it's sort of, a dispute over like trade routes and like fishing in the water between the two nations. And there's lots of little sort of political things like that. That's what this map sort of does, is that they just sort of place points like, here's a point in between these two nations. They fight over it for this reason. There's a couple of those that are kind of interesting. Harry Bulkan, I think, was mentioned in the quick start, but I don't think we learned too much about it. They clarify in this book, Harry Bulkan is it's a specific part of the Fire Nation capital city. It's sort of like the area where the high ups basically of the Fire Nation live in the kind of caldera. So there's that. Netsuo Island, Natsuo Island. I believe this is the island. It's in between the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom, and Sozin wants it for like resources, and so Sozin and then the Earth King of the time, Jailun, I think is his name. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. They're both sort of like, you go first. No, you go first. So like, I'll look better when I come in and stop this. Kind of cool. Probably one of the cooler bits is Water Tribe's Sacred Island. So it's an island right in the middle of the ocean. It's actually closer to the Earth Kingdom or Fire Nation than either of the Water Tribes. But it's significant to the Water Tribes because it's like the halfway point between the two Water Tribes. And they describe that this is where they will often go, both tribes, to deal with disputes. And most of the leaders in Water Tribe history try to go there at least once in their life because it's a sacred place. That's really cool. There's also they named the capital city of the Southern Water Tribe Wolf Cove. That I think is new information, even though it kind of maybe feels like we should have known that already. But yeah, what are your thoughts on some of these new place names on the map?
Yeah, no, I thought all of that was actually really cool. I mean, just having the map by itself, like you mentioned earlier, is just really good because, when you're going through reading this and everything, like they'll specifically mention, a name, and you can just like key back up to the map. Like this is something that feels like we should have had before, like, something this clear and explicit. And I know there have been different maps that other people have put together, and there have been like some, I guess more general maps that have been, official as well. But to me, at least, this feels like the most sort of clear-cut map that we've actually, gotten for the Avatar verse, and I guess sort of like ever. So to have these sort of names and, some of these names I can remember from when we've discussed them before, but I'm never quite sure where they actually are. So, this is something that's like really cool. Like, whenever books have stuff like this where they have like the map that actually outlines where things are, it's always like a great reference point, just to sort of see where things are in relation so you can get like a sense of, I guess, just a sense of like scale of the world and how long it could take things, and why air bison are so important, and sort of the modernization of the steamships for the Fire Nation, which is something that's mentioned a lot in this book. Why that's so important to like the trade routes and sort of the shipping. And I think a lot of the sort of, I guess, auxiliary characters that this sort of core book sort of brings up, speaks a lot towards that. And they have a lot of sort of like interesting sort of side stories with these, I guess, newer characters that, deal all around that. So, having the idea of this map and the basis of the world, it really goes a long way, I think.
Yeah, a lot of these new places kind of you can see why they sort of help like gameplay of the different eras, in that like if you set your story in the north of the Earth Kingdom, you're going to have to deal with the fact that there's this like conflict between the Earth Kingdom and the Water Tribe up in the north, and that if you go into those waters, they describe it like in that era, the Roku era. Basically, it's both tribes, both kingdoms, blockading each other. So lots of like ships during this sort of industrialized era in that area of the water. Kind of same situation with like one of the other islands, Natsuo Island. Like you're going to have to deal with a conflict if you go there. And even just little things like, oh yeah, the whole Sun Warrior ancient city. Like whereabouts was that? Like in reflection, we learn it's a fire island, but which one of them was it? So you find out that it actually is more separate than all of the other islands, in that like it's closer to the Western Air Temple than it is to the Fire Nation. So that's why it's more out of the way, why it's more hidden. Similarly, Bonte Island is also a little bit more separated than a lot of the other islands, and it also fits with the idea that okay, Korra left for the Fire Nation from the Southern Water Tribe, so yeah, she probably would have washed up on an island there, more so than an island over here. So a lot of stuff like makes logical sense as well. So that's good. Obviously they could have filled it in with other place names that we know about. In that I would have almost like preferred or liked it if they had like a separate map for each nation, just to kind of fill it in a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Especially like say for the Kyoshi era, where we learn about like sort of like Mainka Island and so on, like which one's that and so on. But it's still it's really good, and they can always, because like we know there's like another book, and then there's going to be like the Republic City book, the Spirit World book. We can get more maps if they need to have them. Yeah, and then like it's one of those ones where like yes, if you know all of the lore, if you've read all the comics, all the material, and you know it all. If you just look through the book and read it looking for the new information, yeah, you'll probably be relatively like disappointed purely from that perspective. But it is still, I think, just fun to read through because they frame it like an encyclopedia, and it gives you just a certain context of, this is what's going on in the Water Tribe during this era from like a political standpoint and so on. A way you don't really ever look at it, in that like, yeah, this ultimately comes across from like Aang's era that this is the case, but wording it in this way, it kind of creates the idea of like, oh yeah, there is that going on in the background, and that's what makes it fun. Even if this section doesn't feature like any new information, it's still written pretty nicely and is kind of filled with details for especially sort of like more casual fans, or sort of people who are trying to get to being the sort of lore experts. Recapping a lot of that detail is good. So that's what it's for, basically, especially like people who are, because I saw like in the Discord and stuff like that, people were saying that like, oh, I only basically got into Avatar because they announced this book. So for those people who are getting used to the universe, this is like amazing stuff, and so much of it is new. Like the mention like early on in the Water Tribe section that like, oh yeah, there's also the Foggy Swamp Tribe in the Earth Kingdom. Is like
Yeah.
nice stuff. Um, what else do we have here? Struggling to know like what way to do this as such, and that like they give a general section on the Water Tribe, and it explains like, okay, Agnakella, Wolf Cove, Foggy Swamp, Spirit Portals. It goes over Twee and Law and mentions that sort of stuff, which is kind of cool. Um, and there's interesting things like say like maybe the wording on something like the brave sacrifice of Yue, the Northern Water Tribe princess, restored Twee at the cost of Yue's own life. That feels weirdly worded, just because after that it feels more like the ocean spirit, sorry, the moon spirit is Yue. Like Yue is part of it rather than she restored Twee. Now it's a weird one in that I suppose it's more of a combined thing, and it's this weird dynamic where like, well, Yue was really only alive because of Twee, so you know,
Yeah.
that's maybe one of the ones where like that maybe should be worded slightly differently, but it's still accurate. Uh, Even mentioning that like Law has the power to drag an enemy into the fog of lost souls. That oh, like they're clarifying the power of the spirit, that Twee can heal. Law has the power to transport people. That's all cool stuff. Um, but yeah, is there anything I suppose specifically that stood out to you in this sort of like initial section before we're in any era? They just go over the different nations. Any information that stood out to you in this?
Um, I don't know, not particularly. I mean, I think the way that they sort of describe the world to sort of give, I guess, sort of initial people an overall sort of understanding of sort of the general dynamics, I think was done pretty well, just to sort of give you an understanding of where they stand in the world, sort of what their history is, sort of, I guess, sort of like some of like an early understanding of the culture behind them, and sort of, for the people playing the game, sort of like what different things you might be able to do, or you might be able to look forward towards in terms of like sort of like the balance of the world and how they work with each other, or how the nations work with each other, and sort of, sort of what can be developed in sort of like each of the eras as well, even before you get into any of the like specific eras. So no, I think they do a really good job of just the general stuff, just laying it out for everybody, which is really important. So to just have everyone sort of on the same sort of, I guess, playing field. But in terms of just pure, understanding the world, I think it works pretty well. Like this might even be something good for someone to read even before sort of like getting into the shows and stuff potentially.
I suppose just on the section on Bossing Say, one thing I really liked about this section is that they actually go really in depth on explaining the walls and the different kind of like regions, basically. Outer wall, the agrarian zone, defensive inner wall, lower ring, middle ring, upper ring, even going as far as to sort of explain that upper ring people can go anywhere, middle ring people can go anywhere except the upper ring, and then lower ring people to travel anywhere need a passport. But in terms of history, like this is not in any particular era, I do find it interesting that they mention it's one of the oldest cities in the world, but they don't mention the known piece of information that the city used to be like an underground city, which is why we have the catacombs underneath. I get that none of the eras we deal with is far enough in the past to where that matters all that much, outside of acknowledging that Ba Sing Se has underground kind of crystal catacombs. But given that's something we do know, I would have liked to have seen that added in. Other than that, a lot of the stuff is good. Like they explain Omashu, Siwang Desert, Kyoshi Island. Fire Nation, I like that they cover stuff like they bring in the Kyoshi stuff, the Camellia Peony War. They explain the whole idea that like the sage's involvement with actually being quite heavily involved in the running of the Fire Nation until effectively, Ozai really stopped that. So all that stuff I think is pretty interesting overall. There's sections like Bonte Island, Ancient Sun Warrior City, where like they just cover the basics. They don't tell you too much more. But I do like that, like littered throughout all of this is stuff like the Sun Warriors, the city inhabitants, were the first people to master firebending after humans left the Line Turtle cities. And then I think in the Water Tribe section, there's a nice clarification for anyone got confused by beginnings at all, that they even say like the first waterbenders actually learned bending from watching the Ocean and Moon Spirits. Just kind of clarifying that like Avatar made with the wording made it feel a bit weird that like they learned bending in the first place from this, when no, it's the kind of martial art that was learned. That's added in here pretty nicely without creating any confusion. Air Nomad sections just covers the temples and all the basics. I'll just make the point here about the section here, A World of Balance, on bending. I do find it interesting that there's a section later on in the mechanics about bending, and it goes into like the special forms of bending. And it feels like maybe that section should have been up here, just because it then makes that section, I think it's in like chapter 7 or something like that, where they tackle special bending as like, are you making a statement about how learning techniques works in the game, or like canonically within the world? Because that section later on in the book kind of implies that like any firebender can learn combustion bending if they kind of try hard enough, basically, which I suppose on a very technical term feels like okay, but doesn't really feel correct to me. And so just the separation of like, when they do bring sort of canon information in later on in the book, it makes it feel like, but we're outside of the section on canon information, so what is and is not correct. I don't know, did you see that section of the book later on when they mentioned that?
No, I didn't get to that section.
Okay, let's see. Well, I'll find that myself while we talk about something else. I suppose after that, like they have a section on the spirit world, Order of White Lotus, and then it basically goes into the Kyoshi section. So I suppose, what were your thoughts on the Kyoshi era? This is the era we learned about the most recently. So basically 90% of this or more is just from those novels. But interestingly, the Air Nomad section doesn't have too much from the books. They do actually flesh that out here, which is quite nice. But overall, what were your thoughts on how they presented the Kyoshi era?
Yeah, overall, I thought this was pretty cool. Since, we do have, this is the section that we have the most, I guess, sort of like written information of, just because it's what came out in the book. I think this part, read to me pretty well. Like, I like how they describe the different sort of nations in this era, how they integrate, Kyoshi's role, how they talk about her as an avatar during this era, how, sort of the mistrust for her sort of not being like officially seen as the avatar to begin with. And that's something that, she's constantly dealing with, and, sort of the different sort of fractions that are around, and how you as a player might have to deal with them, and just how they link into the world, and just the whole idea of sort of piracy in this era, and how that sort of plays out, and how it's been somewhat dealt with, but there's still different fragments or splinter groups that are around that you might have to deal with, and how that might play into how you might see the world as a character, and just how that goes in general for how sort of the nations are dealing with it. So I don't know, I think it does a good job of sort of fleshing out some sort of extra, I guess, sort of motivations of the world that might not necessarily have been covered in the Kyoshi novels directly, because the Kyoshi novels are obviously more geared towards around her as a character rather than sort of the Avatar world during this era at large. So from that perspective, I thought it was pretty good how they sort of integrate those parts into sort of the gameplay and to the lore of the universe in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the main new thing in terms of like doing more with the Air Nomad stuff is, of course, referencing what we know already, like Kelsong, Jinpa, but using some of those kind of examples as a way to sort of create the sort of like the tone atmosphere of the airbenders at the time, that they are quite stuck in their ways and almost like very judgmental of people who in any way go against it, and that helps to explain what happened to Kelsong after he became like the living typhoon, and that whole incident happened, that they just completely tried to almost like write him out of their history, despite him being one of basically like their greatest kind of airbenders, because he's a master airbender, helped with the Avatar, and was one of the most spiritual characters as well, but they still exiled him and didn't want to ever talk about him, just because he killed people actually trying to, solve the crisis of the era with the bandits and pirates and Dao Fei and so on. So I do like that, and it also, I think, gives good context to Kyoshi's mother, Jaisa, leaving the Air Nomads as well, given that they're so strict on their culture during this era. So that's kind of cool. I did find the section later on in the book. It is in chapter 7. There's a whole section called Specialized Bending. Now, like I said, this section is called Advancement. It's because it's covering the idea of like your player character within the game and how you master your bending disciplines and use your techniques. So most of this is just game stuff, but then there is this section where it feels like it's more lore, in that it says there are forms of bending that are so specialized only a small subsection of benders can even perform them. Earthbenders can all bend rocks, but even in the Korra era, not all earthbenders can also bend metal. Waterbenders can all bend a stream, but only small portion of them have the training and the aptitude to bloodbend. These specialized bending forms aren't unique abilities gifted only to a few special characters, but they are extremely difficult to master. In many cases, some benders find so little aptitude for a given form, like metal bending, they are unable to ever learn to do it. In most cases, however, these specialized forms are an expansion of the bender's natural abilities, not new abilities altogether. In general, I think that's fine. But I think they try too hard to sort of almost like play both sides of saying that, yes, there's a reason only 2 characters can combustion bend, but they really want to open the door to make it so that you can actually learn combustion bending. And now I don't know if this is really making a canonical statement about, does this mean like, say, Zuko could go on to learn combustion bending or not? Because I think just for fun reasons, if you play a firebender character, they want you to be able to get combustion bending at some point in your campaign, because that's cool and fun and exciting. And locking a character off from just because they're not like 7 foot tall and don't have this tattoo on their forehead feels kind of a little bit unfair. In that, like, it's general enough to where I'm kind of like, okay, I get sort of what you're going for here, but it feels like it's asking for much more specific wording here to get this across. So from what I just read out there, what's your take on, like, is this making like a statement on these special abilities and how we're meant to view it, like, canonically?
I don't know. I think for the sake of what they're doing here, I probably wouldn't take that as canonical as some of the earlier, sort of sections, which to me, in my mind, that kind of makes sense why it's separated. If it was up top, then I probably would think that it's more in line with sort of like the history of the world. So for me, I think, I mean, it's okay. I mean, I think there's, maybe they could have worded that a bit better as I'm reading through it and whatnot. Because, it is something that would be cool to be able to do in the sake of sort of like the game and the idea behind it. So I don't know. I mean, it definitely seems like maybe it could have been worded a bit better, but in terms of the overall idea of this whole, role-playing core game book, it works for that sake, I guess.
Yeah, because I think they're using the word aptitude as like this real get out of jail kind of word here, in that, but that basically is what we're talking about here. This is the rarity, effectively, of that skill. If you can do it or not does come down to aptitude. I think I get the point they're trying to make about this, if this is a canon statement, which is effectively that bloodbending is still waterbending. Yes, we view it as a different skill, but it's still waterbending at its core. you're not doing sort of, a separate form of like bending magic to do blood bending versus to just bend a stream of water, like the contrast that they're making here. It's just that a bloodbender is so powerful, they can apply their water bending on such a sort of small scale that they can make this thing happen. So they're sort of making this case that, like, theoretically, say a really powerful firebender like Iroh, who knows effectively all avenues of firebending, could theoretically learn combustion bending if he was able to sort of study the nature of that ability, how it works, and develop a way to sort of teach himself it.
Yeah.
I think that's the point that's kind of being made here, but they don't go into enough detail to actually make that. Because I'd always make the point that I think the Avatar state sort of allows most avatars to do lava bending. It's because they have like all the power in the world effectively. And lava bending for me mainly just comes down to you need a lot of power to do that, to make that happen. And that's just the kind of separation here. I get the point that, like, they don't want to just basically say that sort of Amon is magic and he has like psychic bloodbending magic and no one else has that. He just has a strong aptitude for it, but I still think it's relatively accurate to say that, like, he has a bloodline based ability that is specific to him and his family. But anyway, that sidebar out of the way, we were talking about the Kyoshi era. And yeah, like, it obviously goes very heavy in on the whole Dao Fei bandits, which is the thing of the era. But it is probably also what makes it feel a little bit like, I wish they maybe added in something else, because it does feel a little bit like it's just Dao Fei, bandits. Like, that's all the Kyoshi era kind of is. Now, there is more here, but it's where you can sort of tell outside of the Roku era, they are very reliant on the material that we already have. So there's a little bit of kind of frustration kind of there with that. But it's presented nicely. Like, if you're not familiar with the books or have only maybe read it once and haven't had time to go back and constantly reread it, some of this stuff, like important events of the Kyoshi era, is nice the way it's recapped. Like the Wars of Secrets and Daggers. Like, I barely remembered myself that that specific like term was actually mentioned in the book, but they go over like what it is and the whole politicians protecting themselves. And I like how they have the two paragraphs and then the consequences of this, the takeaways from this event happening are this, and this is how it will affect like your story. And it's a nice just like little 3 bullet points to explain this is happening in this era. I think that's actually one of the cooler sections of the book, is when they go over these key events. The fall of the Fifth Nation, Yellowneck Uprising, the false Avatar. And it has these things where like it has these sort of story hooks, like say the fall of the Fifth Nation directly relates to Tagaka being captured in the first Kyoshi novel. They sort of set up the idea that like you should tell a story where someone tries to break Tagaka out of prison. And it just makes me kind of wonder, so are we meant to interpret it that canonically this event happens? Like, we maybe don't know the full details about it, but someone somewhere somehow tried to break Tagaka out of prison, and we can sort of say that canonically, even if we don't know the details about it. That's just the one slight criticism I've had of this section, is that there's a separate section in the book called Adventure Hooks, which is sort of setups for stories very clearly, is that you should use this character doing this happening, and so on. Whereas this is more of the, I think, this is locked in. This is what's already happened. So the few times when they mention, you should tell a story with this, feels like, I don't know what to do with the idea that you've said that this thing could happen. Like, is it canon or not? What's your take on that? I think there's one egregious example in the Airbender section I'll get to in a second, but what are your thoughts on how this settings chapter does the sort of story setup things.
Yeah, I mean, that does happen a couple times, and I don't know. I guess that's probably one of the harder things from our perspective of looking at this sort of role playing game book is that we're sort of looking at it via sort of like sort of the history and sort of the future of the Avatar verse and sort of the different stories that may or may not have happened in the past, and this isn't sort of a clear cut sort of answer towards that because I mean the whole idea of someone, sort of going and trying to sort of like free her and sort of the whole idea of the splinter fleets is like a really cool, like, idea. Like I have that throughout, a couple different sections of like, this would be a cool story if they were to sort of expand upon it, but we don't really have the full sort of like scope of how things actually work. And the idea that they do have the whole sort of like adventure hooks, which I would take it as more of being like just sort of like these are the things you make up your own that probably didn't happen, but they could happen. Sort of things. It works well. Like everything. I think maybe the problem is that like it plays too well with everything, which is good that they did their job in that regard. It just makes it sort of I guess sort of interesting in terms of where we're coming from and the whole point of the story. So definitely, I mean, it seems completely like plausible to me that that would sort of happen. And there's even like some other sections where they mention these people are in prison, but you could get to them to sort of get information, or you could get to them and maybe you could get them out, but it would be like a really really hard thing to sort of break in and get them out. So they do that a couple times throughout the whole sort of errors that they have here for the people who are in prison that we do know of.
Yeah, I like later on when they get to Zahir, and they word it in a way where it's like, you probably won't get him out. You really probably won't get him out, but you could try.
Exactly.
As in, like,
yeah.
It would be very difficult to tell a story with such an important character if you actually released him. So please, probably don't try to do this. But maybe. So with the Kyoshi era, it's the Air Nomad section where there's a lot of new stuff, like I said. I'll just read out some of this stuff at the start, just to give you like a sense for how they actually go about sort of setting the stage for each era. The Air Nomads have isolated themselves while struggling with mounting internal issues. Leading into this era, Earth Kingdom sages blamed the Air Nomads' detachment for Kuruk's failures as an avatar. This tension continued when the Air Nomads of the Southern Air Temple provided sanctuary to Kyoshi after her confrontation with Janju. Many opposed the idea that she was the true avatar, but the Air Nomads still took her in. This has culminated in the Air Nomad elders focusing their people on internal matters, not only to avoid conflict, but as a matter of survival. And they kind of bring in the idea then that because banditry is such a big thing in this era, do the Air Nomads get out of that isolation and help the people or not? Because people have been very critical of them during this era and they're becoming sort of detached. They bring up also the idea of, because Avatar Kuruk did so much like fighting with dark spirits, spiritual sites across the world are like damaged and broken because of the Yangchen deals are broken, and then Kuruk has like killed spirits, effectively. So how do they deal with that? And they don't really know what to do. It's just a cool idea of, the Air Nomads when they, in this era, are almost less like the sort of Jedi that we typically associate them as being in other eras, where they try to sort of keep to themselves this time out. And I think like one of the characters is even kind of avidly like, no, we should stick to ourselves, basically. So all that stuff is I think really cool. I suppose, what are your thoughts on how they better present the Air Nomads here after we only got a little bit on them in the books?
No, I think that definitely helps to sort of flush out your sort of perspective of them, just to sort of get an overall idea of sort of like, how they're viewed in the world, how, other people are viewing them, how, some people can go to them for, some support, but other people sort of are still sort of, don't really understand them as well, which, I guess considering what eventually does happen to them, it doesn't sort of like help them overall. So no, I think they did a really good job with them in this era. I mean, I think in general for the eras that they exist, of course, they do a really good job of characterizing the air nomads or the air nation in terms of how they're viewed in the world or how their sort of like politics are going on, which is something that I feel, no, obviously because they weren't really around for most of it. We don't really get that about them as much. So when we do get that, even in sort of the next era, I think that really sort of stands out in general, just in terms of how they're viewed and how they're sort of, viewed later on, especially in like in Roku's era. I think this is pretty cool to see how that was played out for them.
Yeah, the frustrating part for me was just this kind of one section. New character introduced here. Gyemsten? Some of the names here are pretty wild. I'm not sure how to pronounce them. Gyemtsen, an air nomad, an air nun fighting her secret desire to exact revenge. So she is an air nun from the Eastern Air Temple, left her position as a sought-after airbending teacher to protect the Singing Path after her sister died protecting it. The Singing Path is a spiritual site in the Earth Kingdom guarded by a spirit named Rong, or O-N-G, and is now corrupted by a Daofei group known as the Ghost Tigers, using it as a hideout. Thanks to continued harassment by the Ghost Tigers, Rong now wishes to pull her home into the spirit world, but can't do it while they're still there. Ever since her death, her sister's death at the hands of the Ghost Tigers, Gyemsten struggles with urges to exact vengeance, urges that violate the ethics of the air nomads. She chases the Ghost Tigers through the winding stones of the Singing Path and steers them away from neighboring towns, while inching ever closer to the idea that if she can't find a way to remove them from the Singing Path peacefully, she will do it by force. Again, this is one of those ones where like, that all sounds really, really cool. And the idea for this character is cool. But then there's some of the details here, like, okay, new Daofei group, name, Ghost Tigers, that's cool, never heard about them before. New spirit who guards a location in the physical world, Wrong, cool. But then directly above this is just a little sort of cut-in piece of information that says, what is the Singing Path? Who is Wrong? What other spiritual sites are the MNs losing? Those specifics are up to you in your game, and I'm kind of like, come on, a little bit more. Like, why, like, especially with the spirit, why do you give the name of a spirit, the name of the location it protects, but, like, no description of, like, what makes this spirit, like, unique? No real description of what makes the location particularly unique. So it's kind of weird that like they make this very minor thing, just the name, canon, but then don't make anything else canon. Later on, like I think it's the Roku era, they do something similar, but they actually describe what the spirit looks like and better describe the area. And it feels a bit better compared to sort of that. But you can see the character there, Gyemsen, is kind of gone into with a bit of depth, and I do like that idea of, some like vengeance, like sister died here and does she go to attack or not? That like there are some really cool concepts at play here. Is there any specific part of this new stuff from the Air Nomad era that you particularly liked?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really like how they did a lot of the air nomad characters in general. I think that I guess the idea behind not knowing them as much definitely is sort of like adds to their sort of interest in general. But yeah, I don't know. I think for me, I think I have a lot of notes here on a lot of the different air nomad characters as being just sort of, I don't know, sort of stand out in terms of some of them sort of being, I guess, sort of against sort of the air nomad sort of like standards or norms. Like even the character that comes right after Jensen also has sort of, I guess, sort of a interesting idea in terms of, sort of holding on to different things and sort of being a bit of a troublemaker. But no, I think a lot of the Air Nomads characters, I think, to me at least, they seem to stand out more than some of the other characters, just in terms of their place in the world. Although there are some fire characters that I remember from the next section that do sort of stand out to me. But no, I think overall they're pretty interesting. I mean, there are certain parts where there would be, I don't know, it could stand to have maybe a bit sort of more information, especially, when you do compare it to other sections that do have the more information, but maybe that's sort of one of those things where they had like more leeway in some sections to others in terms of like adding new things to the story, or maybe those are the parts where there actually are things that are more being developed that we just don't know about, so they're sort of holding back on us in those sort of regards. So I don't know. It's definitely a cool setup, regardless of how they're eventually going for it.
Yeah, like there's a few weird things, like say threats and challenges. Actually, a really cool section. I find it a bit weird that they have protecting the Avatar relics as like a huge thing, like the first thing here in the Air Nomad section. Like it gets mentioned, it's a plot point in the Kyoshi novels, but I don't feel like it really needs to be made into more of a plot point other than what was already presented of it. This is where maybe there's a few times where they maybe kind of grasp at a few ideas that are already in play, when maybe come up with something like new and different. But I do like, criticism of philosophy. That seems to sort of be the main theme of the Air Nomads in this era. That they're actually being criticized for being like too detached and stuff like that. It sort of feels like the Star Wars prequel sort of Jedi type thing. They're getting those criticisms for how they are. That's kind of cool. Kyoshi era water tribe. Again, we also didn't learn too much about like the relationship between the tribes. So you learn a bit here of like the startling differences between the northern and southern water tribes are never more apparent than during the Kyoshi era. The southern water tribe has suffered economically for some time, which has led to people pursuing a life of piracy. So this explains the whole where the Fifth Nation actually comes from, is the kind of struggle of the Southern Water Tribe. Northern Water Tribe has economic success in this era because of their like military and so on, strong population, and so on. So kind of cool things here. And this is where, like, because there's such a difference between North and South, they're actually a little bit more at odds with each other and not communicating very well. This is also like a big thing to look for in each of these things, is basically like with the Air Nomads, it's like how much are they helping the rest of the world is sort of the main question for each era. With the Water Tribes, it's like how well are they communicating with each other in this era. Like with the Fire Nations, it's often like how at odds are the clans with each other, or how heavy is the Fire Lord in control during that era. So I like that there are those like common themes that they do introduce in the like intro section. But does anything stand out to you in the Water Tribe section for Kyoshi's era?
I think probably most of the stuff that stood out for me for that one, or at least ones that I have notes on, is probably usually the sort of Fifth Nation stuff. That and sort of, I think there's another one, or is that a different era? No, I think most of it for this one is the Fifth Nation stuff. I mean, I guess the other part that stood out to me were there were a couple sort of mentions of just sort of different things in the spirit world or the spirit oasis, that sort of stood out with me in terms of just being a note that those were of importance during this era, or just that there seemed to be a lot of, I guess, sort of interaction with the water tribes and the spirits during this time particularly, that they make note of, and that could be explored later on for, I guess, future character story parts. So no, I thought those were definitely pretty cool in this section.
Yeah, they really create that idea of like, well, Ko came out of the spirit oasis to take Umi, so there's like sort of danger there. Like, maybe do a story where another spirit comes out of that entrance, because there's issues with the spirits during this era. There's like 3 new Water Tribe characters here that are introduced, and you can sort of tell at times with some of these characters that like this character is not particularly important. Like they do a decent job of creating a bit of a story, but this character really only exists so that, like, say the Water Tribe in this era has a weapons expert, so that that you can, have a character who's a non-bender learn something from someone here. They kind of fill in gaps like that of like, oh wait, there's no technology expert in the Air Nomad, so let's have that character kind of come in here. There's a few of them that are just like they're here mainly for like game purposes, but they are making the character canon, which is kind of like, you know, interesting. But you can tell where like there's the detailed writing and then the sort of like, yeah, we just sort of need to do that. So like Pitsiolak is like an old warrior who blames the recent history of young people going off to become pirates on the water tribes, the Klein and stuff like that. But like they say here, it's just like, here's your boomerang expert. He'll teach you some pretty crazy stuff. That's about it. And yeah, like a general point, some of these new water tribe names are like pretty long and difficult to say. Like Apalarjuk, double A in the middle. Adventurous courier from the Southern Water Tribes who like delivers correspondences between the two tribes, which must be quite the job given that they're on opposite sides of the world. Interaction with the White Lotus during this era, kind of interesting stuff. There's a kind of Northern Water Tribe healer who became a pirate, and they make a note that that's interesting because it's usually Southern Water Tribe people who join the pirates. So a Northerner doing that is actually kind of interesting. There's the leader of one of those Fifth Nation splinter fleets who might maybe want to break out Tagaka, you know, that sort of thing. Kind of cool. But that's mostly it for the Kyoshi era. Obviously, the Roku era is sort of the star of the show here because going into this, we knew next to nothing about this era. You think on what we know before this, and it's like 306 is like it. It's Roku, Sozin, the story. And so it's interesting that the era starts off by literally saying, the Roku era specifically details the time between Sozin's coronation and Avatar Roku's wedding. So they're making the point here that it's this whole era that we're talking about here is before Roku and Sozin's like conflict. So the main thing you know has not actually happened yet in this era. So it's all this stuff beforehand that you have to bring in of just like, you know, they were friends when they were young. He's, I suppose, completed his Avatar training, but the Sozin hasn't told Roku of his ambitions yet. That's kind of interesting. Everything here is basically new, and they add so much onto this. The thing I think everyone, and has actually gotten out to most of the fandom and gotten everyone talking about, the most significant new piece of information they introduce here is that Sozin has a sister, and that she actually plays a really significant role during this era of like opposing the royal family, basically. So pretty crazy stuff. A lot of people sort of freaking out about just how kind of in depth they go on some of these stories. So this character, Sozin's sister, is Princess Zeisan, Zeisan. They have a one-line description of her as a chi-blocking princess working to undo her family's corruption. Really cool idea for a character. I suppose before we even get into maybe some of the details, what were your thoughts on this? The introduction of like Sozin having a sibling full stop, but then how big they sort of go with this character.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they did say that this would be the section that has the most added to it. So, you know, they definitely held up in that sort of regard there. But yeah, no, in general terms of just, you know, adding this character and have it, I mean, I guess, you know, in terms of, you know, Fire Nation with, you know, Zuko and Azula, you know, it kind of like, it plays into that, you know, sort of sibling sort of aspect there. And so I think, you know, it works well. Like it's familiar enough that, you know, we as fans sort of can grasp onto it, but it's, you know, it actually adds like a lot to the dynamic that we didn't already know. And even if, you know, of course we know sort of like the eventual outcome of this, if it, you know, actually plays out and all that stuff and whatnot, it's still really a cool sort of setup and sort of the integration of the air nomads and how that plays into this role here, along with sort of the sort of added sort of, you know, romance sort of angle to it as well. I think, you know, it definitely, you know, out of everything that we've seen so far, which of course makes sense, definitely adds the most to sort of the world and sort of the politics that are going on during this era. And, you know, it's interesting that it is just, you know, in essentially this like not really a long period of time. Like, the Kyoshi era could be like, however long. And, obviously we know for like Aang's and Korra era, the exact area, but this seems like it's even more sort of, I guess, sort of focus in a way in terms of, the overall length of, what is actually going on during this period of time and how, it works with all the different nations. So it's definitely a good like starting point. Like it feels like, if they ever did something like this in another media format, that this would play really well into that sort of idea, which I guess if this is what they spent the most time on in sections like that, then it definitely works in that regard. But no, I think it's definitely pretty cool. I have seen that this has been like the thing that has been out. Like I think someone already did like a rendition of what the character might look like as well. So no, it's definitely a really cool added bit to the whole overall universe, Avatarverse.
Yeah, I suppose that sort of just you mentioning that like someone did fan art kind of brings up the idea that there's not a ton of like images throughout this book, which makes sense. I think we went in knowing that. The book uses screenshots from the show, a lot of the sort of stock imagery you'd see on merchandise and stuff like that. There's a few new pieces of art, but it's mainly as the sort of, kind of, there are many examples of like, you could make your sample, your RPG character look like this or something like that, just to be really sort of like flashy, unique character ideas for each of the playbooks. I am interested to see what these new pieces of art are for the chapter titles, if like it is new art or it's just the design that needs to be put in place. But it is interesting for some of this new stuff. There's no attempt to like show you what these characters look like, and so for say Sozin's sister, it feels like not even an image there. So there's a kind of limit, I suppose, what they're showing you here. There is a sense that this character feels like very important. I'd like to see what she looks like, but who knows what we could get kind of coming out of this. But to go into some details here, if you don't have the PDF yet, the Sozin's sister links quite heavily into a lot of stuff. It connects a lot of stuff together. It's very interlinked, some of the stuff from this era, in that they basically describe that the young nobility of the Fire Nation are beginning to embrace air nomad philosophy. And they played off this in like two different angles of like the air nomads have come to sort of accept this and be like, okay, they want to learn, we'll teach them. And so there's this center for learning that's like a joint venture between the air nomads and the Fire Nation. And this is the very sort of like official thing of like, you can come here and you can learn air nomad philosophy. And they play off this both in terms of like the air nomads influencing the Fire Nation nobility, but then also the Fire Nation nobility potentially influencing air nomads as being an issue that the leadership on both sides is dealing with. Because Sozin doesn't like the idea that his people are beginning to accept like ideals that take away from what he ultimately wants to do in secret. And the air nomads are wondering that like by interacting with like high up people in the Fire Nation, they might be like lured away or something like that. So his sister, Sozin's sister, also is kind of part of this kind of movement in that she also embraces these ideals. She's a non-bender, but learns chi blocking from one of the air nomad characters of this era, Sister Ryoshan. Again, pronunciation, not sure. They basically get across the idea that during this training, those two effectively fell in love, but because Sozin's sister wants to actually stop Sozin's plans for what he's going to do, and a lot of the stuff that she knows he's up to, but no one else really does, she realizes that she has to sort of, in a way, like use like a public romance for herself as a political kind of situation to get power herself. So the other side of the air nomad stuff is this group called the Guiding Wind, which are like a splinter group separated from the airbenders, who disagree with how like official and the interaction with the nobility is going on that kind of public scale, and they just want to do things in a completely different way. So she has like this political marriage planned with the leader of that group, and then they add like another layer onto this where like Sozin is trying to sort of like defame the Guiding Wind by like making out that they're committing all these acts of violence, but it's clear that it's not actually them doing it. So lots of crazy stuff going on here, and you can sort of tell that the content here is a lot more like this was written specifically for this, and there's a plan in mind with so much of this, and I love how interlinked it all is completely. Like, what are your thoughts on some of that air nomad stuff there? Both the fact that the Fire Nation is being influenced by them, but then also this renegade Guiding Wind group. What are your thoughts on what they do there?
This is definitely really cool to see sort of the interconnectedness of sort of, these two nations at this point in time, and how that's sort of, influencing sort of, the sort of future, I guess, sort of ambitions that Sozin has in this era here. And, just, I don't know, I think it's really cool to see how that works, and how they're sort of, some are trying to be sort of more selfless in terms of sort of helping or help stop, what'll eventually happen, future on in this era here. So no, I think that's really cool to see this. I mean, even the idea of like sort of the Guiding Wind and sort of how they view sort of the integration, I guess, of sort of the Fire Nation nobility, because, they also do welcome them into their ranks, but in order to be welcomed into their ranks, they have to sort of like disavow all of their sort of nobility and sort of their lofty sort of like ideals that they have, versus the sort of center that they have opened in the Fire Nation right now. The nobility is sort of like only sort of like halfway in, like they're not sort of like renouncing everything that they've had so far. So there's that whole sort of conflict there, and I think that sort of plays out really well in terms of, I guess sort of what story you might actually play with this. But in the grand scheme of like the whole history here, that's really interesting, just because, if the princess was sort of, I don't know, I think that's interesting because if the princess was sort of like integrated into sort of the air nomad culture via this, specific center, but now she has to join the other group in order to sort of, stop what, Sozin's trying to do. But that's, I don't know, there's a lot of sort of back and forth and push and pull there, which I think, makes for, of course, an interesting story, which is the whole point of this, right?
Yeah. And I think at one point they even mentioned the idea that like the center runs the risk of making sort of air nomad culture almost this like fad within the Fire Nation politics, and like almost making light of it a little bit, that like they'll do this for a few years and then people will not care about it, and the contrast between like committing to it full on and it may be making a change in the Fire Nation, or it just being this thing that the privileged nobles are doing to be a little bit rebellious and so on. There's a lot of depth that they go into here with it, and I like it. They even have like a page in each of the eras that mentions like these are just the themes. This section doesn't really go into any detail on things. It literally just points out Roku era significant themes: connection versus isolation, resources and industrialization, internal conflicts versus external problems, testing alliances, and then propaganda and secrets. Really, really cool. And so there you have your sort of fire and air nomad stuff together, but then there is stuff with the other nations that like kind of connect in that you have the Earth King Jaelun, who, again, this is a point where like they probably could have done a little bit of extra information. I pointed this out in my video, that at one point in this bit they mention that Jaelun is specifically as king making efforts to basically remove or make overly complicated a lot of the progress that Kyoshi made by effectively forcing the 46th Earth King to be nicer to the people with the peasant uprising. So he's trying to get rid of that. And they note by name that incident, like Kyoshi and the 46th Earth King. They don't give him a name, but they don't give this Earth King a number. And it just feels like I would have really liked it if they just said that here is the 49th or the 50th Earth King, which I think are the numbers that probably fit best. Just options where they could have given a little bit more information. But again, there's a lot of depth here because they go into, like, they introduce us to a queen of Omashu, and there's a major conflict there between effectively your leader who actually cares and wants to actually do something to try and, like, make it clear, make it more public that your king is terrible, and she wants to just do something to take him out, and like she is a much better leader than he is, and so on, and they have this kind of like conflict going on, and I like that, just very clear, absolute corrupt leader, and then the good leader. Like, there's so many kind of cool dynamics there. They don't quite fully explain why Omashu, like, has a king or queen, but they do get across just like it's important because of the history, the culture, the fact that it is like the second largest place in the Earth Kingdom, and so on. So it roughly gets across why they have it without quite saying that. But what are your thoughts on the Earth Kingdom stuff from the Roku era?
Yeah, no, I thought that's also very interesting. I mean, I guess Omashu's always been sort of the interesting point. So the fact that they make such an interest sort of contrast between Omashu and Ba Sing Se, I think is, it's not, in the previous era is more of like, Earth Kingdom versus the other sort of eras, as well as their own internal strife that they have. And this one here, they sort of focus a bit more on them, sort of their own sort of doings, which I guess maybe sort of leads to them sort of being, first, sort of their outskirts sort of areas being sort of attacked later on eventually. So no, I think it's definitely interesting how to do that. I mean, they even do some parts here where they integrate in sort of Sud, sort of the earthbending master, and sort of how he might play out in the story. So I like that they have like little bits of that in the sort of in their stories here as well. So there's definitely a lot of different, I guess, sort of bits that they go in here. They even mentioned sort of the Dai Li a couple times, and sort of how that's sort of playing out with the world at this current time. So no, I think there's definitely a lot of elements that they integrate into here. Even with Omashu, when they're talking about sort of like the technologies that they have, since that's always been a thing of Omashu that we even see in the show as well, sort of how well that works and integrates into the larger world as well.
Yeah, they even like introduced a little story here where like the king has sent someone out to like sabotage the slides effectively in Omashu, and it's caused some damage, and they set up the idea, this is the queen's option to sort of get some evidence that the king is actually purposely sabotaging people. So this might be how she publicly gets one over on him. So kind of cool, interesting kind of little pieces like that. Like you said, like Sud, they kind of explain he's been summoned to teach the Earth King advanced earthbending techniques. And he's learning a lot being around the king, but because Sud is super straightforward and blunt, he maybe doesn't know the full extent of the information that he has. So it's kind of like, they set up the idea, maybe your hero character could speak to Sud and find out the big details of this. And then the big thing, one of the important events here is what do they call it? The day, or is it the night? The night of silenced sages. Basically, just the king decides one night to just like boom, Earth Sage order is done. He has the Dai Li round up all the Earth Sages, and then effectively the next day, a few of the Earth Sages are back. A lot of them are gone, and they're just renamed as Royal Learning Halls. And they're not sages anymore, but they're Grand Lectors. And this is this immediate way for him to sort of solidify his power. No sages having an influence on the Earth King here. He's controlling sort of key information about things, and that leads into one of the other characters who is one of these sages who decided to become a Grand Lector, but is secretly trying to keep the information of the Earth Sages alive. Like that's really cool, as like they kind of describe this idea that the Earth Sages come across terribly in the Kyoshi books as just like political backstabbers and so on. They try to make amends as we go into the Roku era, but this happens before anything significant can happen. So there's even these little hints of like, you know, using stuff from the previous eras to create a bit of a story that's pretty nice overall. They use the whole Roku destroyed the Crescent Island Fire Temple, the Escape from the Spirit World Roku, as a setup for like he basically created you know, seismic instability around that island, like what seems like forever, and it causes issues, and actually causes like issues between the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom. So little things like that are very cool. This is where the whole Chenbao thing we mentioned much earlier also comes into play. One little bit of detail I really like here is that Chenbao blamed waterbenders for sending a tsunami, while the Northern Water Tribe blamed earthbenders for creating an underwater earthquake. The truth is that both sides suffered losses from a natural disaster. That's really clever use of like Avatar lore of like, oh yeah, benders, a lot of them technically could cause things that are basically natural disasters. So these accusations are actually valid even though they seem crazy. So it's like, imagine that actually was the truth. Like you can feign natural disasters to get away with things. Like it's a very cool concept. So yeah, there's so much here. Like you even mentioned earlier on briefly, dragon hunts. There's not like a crazy amount of new information here. It lays out. Sozin introduced it. You get an honorary title from killing a dragon, and the rumor goes around is that your skills increase if you kill one, which isn't really the case. But it says here, you know, those with greater or historical or spiritual awareness, such as the Fire Sages, struggle with the murder of ancient creatures with such a deep connection to firebending. The imbalance created by killing these magnificent creatures has already shown up in the natural world. Spirits are drawn to the locations where dragons are slain, and strange occurrences seem to haunt the area. Sozin has sent an elite task force to deal with these occurrences and keep them under wraps from the general population. So I like that this idea of it creates spiritual sort of almost anomalies in the world. That's how significant the loss of these important animals is. And Sozin is trying to like wipe out any weirdness that might make it seem like it's a logical thing to stop hunting the dragons. So really cool. And then I think later on they mention like as a water tribe thing that because they're most of the spiritual people in the world, they go to investigate, and he actually blames the things on them instead of them being the ones investigating what he's done wrong. So Sozin's manipulation is like a overriding theme here of like publicly they get across like he sends like food to poor people. His use of increasing the industry of the Fire Nation actually creates a lot of jobs, but he's doing all this like terrible stuff behind the scenes. So anything I suppose else that like stands out to you from the Roku era that you want to bring up?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was the one that I had thought was really interesting, just sort of how that integrated the Water Tribe into the story, because it seemed, you know, overall, of course, you know, the title of it being the Roku era, it's definitely more focused on sort of the fire side of things, but, you know, they're still able to integrate into how, you know, it's affecting the world sort of overall, you know, sort of, you know, what's happening in the Water Tribes and you know, how they are sort of, you know, I guess sort of trying to connect with each other, but still, you know, not really, you know, there's always sort of that struggle between the two tribes just because of their distance. But, you know, there is communication and it is sort of open, at least during this time. But there's even like another part where they mentioned they were trying to like sow the seeds of like sort of, you know, issues between the two water tribes, which of course is just like a lead into what happens later on, and just sort of keeping them sort of independent from each other and, you know, isolating them from each other. So there's a couple, you know, little bits like that they even put in there about how, you know, what'll happen later on with the water tribes. But yeah, no, it's really, you know, this whole era has a lot of stuff in it, and it's really a good one, of course.
Yeah, because they actually like name the leader of the South, leader of the North for the water tribes, and they could get across that the leader of the South is this very like reasonable person, but the leader of the North can be quite sort of like hot-headed and tend to act. But it's an era where the tribes actually have good communication and work together to present like a pretty united front. And so effectively, like, the Water Tribe is a power of this era, which is kind of different than most of what we've seen. And so they create the idea of like a way to break that would be, well, this dispute up in the North, like, what if they got the leader of the North to attack without consulting the South? That would cause a rift, and they present that as like, there's a clear-cut way to cause an issue in this era. So there's just so many like clever things that I'd like to see, I suppose, canonically what actually does happen in this, and that just a story in this era now seems absolutely fascinating if they ever come around to it. Like, even one of the ones that seems much more directly like, this is clearly here to be a fun sort of campaign for the game, the Grand Tour of the Unity, is a really cool idea that links into the fact that this is the era where we transition from sort of low technology into like the foundation for where we go. It all comes from this era. And here's this ship that is basically bringing all these like high up sort of like engineers. It's going to show off the technology all around the world. And all the leaders are like suspicious of it, and that like, they're deploying spies across the world, even though that's not
Nice.
that's not what's happening here. In that seems like, I think, one of the coolest setups for a campaign, in that most of the time it's set on a ship, but you can go anywhere effectively, and there's all this sort of like spies type stuff, politics going on. So I kind of initially, I think when I read through it the first time, just skimmed past that one, but when I came back to it, it's like, that's actually really, really cool. In that, like, if they ever do a novel, in this era, I'd love to just be like, oh, look, hey, the Unity is over here, and then maybe like in a second novel, it's over here. Just constantly reference the progress of this ship, and that's one of the more like disconnected ones in a way of this era. What else do we have here? Just randomly, one of the characters is named Uzuku Yuyan, and is effectively the origin of the Yuyan archers. They describe that this character, she created this, spiritual, harmonious archery form, and suddenly in the Fire Nation, all these people are like, we want you. Teach my people, teach the military your skill. But she views it as like a spiritual art, not particularly about violence. So what does she do with this? So it's kind of cool that like it's primarily a character there to be sort of the advanced archery teacher in the game, but they tied in like, where did the Yuyan archers come from? They seem like amazing, and here's a little origin story for them, which is really, really nice. But anything else stand out here? Any of these other sort of new characters they introduce or anything?
Let me see. I think there are some other parts that were interesting about the spirits, but we sort of talked about that already. No, I think what you said was exactly the parts that I had noted.
Air nomads, they have obviously the Eudron is an elder who opposes the guiding wind. Kandro is the leader of the guiding wind, and he's kind of engaged to Princess Zaysan. So that's kind of interesting. Ryoshan is the chi blocking expert, who is actually in love with the princess, but their romance, where will it go? So it kind of feels like this is a really interesting one, in that this is almost like the most complete story, but they still leave it like open-ended, as in like you could tell this story yourself.
Yeah.
But it feels like this is probably the most clear-cut one, where it's like, you have to canonically tell what happens in this story. Like, we need to know what Sozin, I'm guessing what Sozin did to his sister at some point, because it feels like this is all leading to, effectively, this creates a situation for Sozin dislikes the air nomads, not just because the next avatar will be born into them. He actually disliked the influence they were having on his nation, and that they sort of I suppose from his perspective, sort of corrupted his sister and caused her to turn against him or something like that. You can get the idea that that's probably how he's thinking about this. And then they also set up the idea that if he finds out that like her true love is to another woman, that might set the stage for why he later goes on to ban same-sex relationships as well. So they do most of the work here for sort of creating the background for his other views. It just feels like, yeah, we probably need to know how this all actually pans out, in that like the guiding wind, I guess, go away at some point. I guess, does the marriage go ahead? Like, it's a cool setup for a story in the game, but it almost feels like, surely you're not going to like waste this only on the game. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you view like the amount of information here as being like pretty much the next book has to be Roku era, or they actually did put the effort in here to just create background for the game?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I think I would figure that their focus is definitely more on the game rather than, you know, the overall progression of sort of the universe per se, but I think it definitely can be integrated, and it definitely would be worth it. Like if that was the next book that was coming out, like I wouldn't be too surprised if they pulled like, you know, all the information from here in terms of, at least for the setup of those sort of stories. I mean, no, it again, you know, we know how things sort of turn out, so it is sort of like essentially a pretty like contained story that, you know, in the grand scheme of things doesn't really matter. But it seems, you know, like it's something that is important in this era. And even if this is something that, you know, like when, you know, the Fire Nation redoes all the history essentially for, you know, the Fire Nation and, you know, essentially what gets out to the rest of the world, that this would definitely be one of the things that gets like swept under the rug and would never be mentioned until, you know, maybe much later on, if ever, for that matter, because like who would, you know, have records of this? But, you know, things always get out, so, you know, there would be no surprise that they could figure out a way to actually get this out in the open. But in terms of like, do they have to do this? I mean, I don't know. I hope they do. I mean, I don't know. I don't necessarily think that it's like completely wasted if it's just done for the story here, but it definitely seems, you know, out of everything that they've done for this core book here, it definitely seems like it has the most, you know, oomph behind it in terms of like being something that could be pushed forward in another media format, which, you know, I think would definitely be worth it and people would be interested in, since, you know, from whatever we've seen and, you know, social media so far from the people that have got this, and or just know about in general, this has been made the most waves. So, you know, they definitely, hopefully they take note that people are interested in it at the very least.
Well, I think that's the thing. Like I don't think any of the other new characters here like feel anywhere near as significant as like Sozin had a sister,
No, of course not.
who like opposed him, and then like all this other stuff, like was a chi blocker, and like they add a lot to this character to make her like unique and like completely different than Sozin. Like you said, it's sort of what they seem to be doing with a lot of the Fire Nation families, of like the kind of duality in a way of like, you know, it kind of seems like almost most of the time it's like the second born has to deal with a lot, but they take a different direction. Obviously like the Ira Ozai is kind of reversed, but you see the idea of like if there's only like two siblings, they each tend to go in different directions, which is kind of cool. The Air Nomads is an interesting section because like right towards the end, threats and challenges, there's just a section called like holding things together, and the last paragraph is like, many airbenders recognize they're starting to be worn thin. While they have enough air nomads to fulfill their duties for now, the temples can sometimes be near empty as members rush out to deal with one disaster or the next. The idea that anyone would mount a full-scale attack on the peaceful air nomads is inconceivable, and yet some air nomads have become aware that if an all-out attack came, they would have trouble mustering enough strength in one place to stop the attackers. And there's a few times in this era where they get across that idea that the air nomads are actually like doing like good work, kind of helping things to keep things together. that like the Avatar, like Roku combined with the Air Nomads, is just about keeping a general peace in the world in this era, but it seems to be at this price of it's stretching the Air Nomads, that if something happened, they can't stop it. And so this is the setup for the kind of the genocide, in a way that it presents the idea almost that if there wasn't all this stuff happening and all the Air Nomads were in the temples, it probably wouldn't have been a genocide, and it probably would have created more of a situation where there was maybe a chance to actually defeat the Fire Nation early in the war, but because it was such a defeat, it was such a victory for the Fire Nation, it created the situation that happened. So what were your thoughts on how they did that here in this, of just the sort of setup towards disaster effectively for the Air Nomads?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely dropped, and it wasn't, a lot of times it wasn't like sort of like, as opposed to like the other stories where, it's sort of clear cut, they're given sort of the back history of everything that's happened. The whole idea of like the Air Nation, or the Air Nomads being sort of weakened is sort of like dropped here and there within sort of the backstory of different characters. Like some are sort of like working towards like secretly like preserving the history, in case something does happen, versus others are just sort of, recognizing sort of the signs of things going on. I mean, they do make, pretty large mention, like you said, that, they're the Air Nomads are working, really well with Roku specifically in order to save, people that are, in trouble or different events, or to stop, potential conflicts from happening. So it's almost, sort of like what we see, during Korra's time when, the Air Nation, does come back and they are more around and they are more involved in things. This is sort of like the initial idea that, the Air Nomads, because of their abilities and, their ways of getting around, that, they're like the perfect people that would be able to sort of, help keep the peace, regardless of what's going on. So that idea, just seeing sort of like, I guess, sort of the origination of that sort of idea, or I guess, however you want to consider origination, since the other story did come first, it's pretty cool just to see how they're working with Roku, in general during this era.
Water Tribe stuff. Again, there's a few new characters here. Like they have the kind of Varric of this era, the character called Teak, whose full name I have no idea how to pronounce. It's Tiqorigianiannig. It does feel a little bit like I understand that they're taking from the actual inspiration for the Water Tribes for these names, but it feels like they almost missed the sort of filter for Avatar for some of these names, that like none of the other Water Tribe names from like the comics or books that we've seen before are this long or anything like that. But it's fine. But there probably should be a pronunciation guide, I think. Teak Riganek, I think. So she's like the Varric of the era. The whole Unity ship is kind of being related to her and stuff like that. That this character Makituk, who is interesting for like a variety of reasons, in that this is kind of like the Unalaq of this era, because they sort of established that like this character lives near the spirit forest, knows the spirit bending technique and stuff like that, but is also a transgender character as well. And I think the sort of representation in this book, there's a few characters like that, like the Southern Water Tribe chief is always referred to as they. Then there's no comment in the section on that character about like, what that means. It's just that's the pronoun used. So there's a few things like that I know a lot of people are kind of excited to see more of in Avatar. But do you have any thoughts on some of this Water Tribe stuff, like Takukak, Avatar Roku's waterbending master, and so on?
Yeah, no, I thought that was pretty cool how they just had that whole, I guess, sort of section about the master, and just sort of I don't know, sort of his sort of, I guess, like his espionage. I mean, I think that was interesting. I mean, I think for all of the, at least in this era, I remember specifically, the sort of backstories for Roku's masters were pretty interesting, and this one is also just as interesting. Just sort of the idea of the stolen technology and how that plays into sort of, the whole idea of Fire Nation's like sort of increasing technological, I guess, sort of advancements that they have. So that's, another interesting, I guess, sort of subplot, I guess you could have in this era, along with just the idea of the spirits and, the character that you mentioned. And even like they even have like a story bit here about sort of like the angered spirits and sort of how, that works with sort of the world at this current time. So no, I mean, I think, we've mentioned before that, there's definitely a lot that sort of integrates them into the to larger scheme of things going on, and I think that really fleshes out the world pretty well here, with all the different characters that they're sort of adding or just adding to that we already
Mm.
know.
Yeah, it's interesting in that, like, obviously, yeah, like we get Takukak here, Sud, we know, like, Roku knows Gyatso, but Gyatso wasn't his, like, airbending teacher, so, like, they don't really go into, like, who his airbending teacher was as such. I guess we're just meant to assume Fire Sage Kaja was his firebending teacher, because I don't think that's necessarily
Mm.
the case, because he was more like his spiritual teacher, but, you know, the Fire Sage is no firebending, so it's interesting that they didn't actually, like, I suppose, do anything with that, like, who Roku's, like, home element teacher is as such, but still, the two that we saw in the show, we do get stuff on, which is kind of nice. Um, but yeah, I think that's most of it. Like, there's so much information in this. Like, it's only like I think 12-ish pages on the Roku era, but it's all new information. It's kind of interesting. Um, I'll readily say, like, the remaining three eras I have not gone through in, like, I think anywhere near enough detail reading through it to talk about it like super accurately. I've skimmed through it a few times just for, like, the really obvious, is there any new information type stuff. Um, and it's again, it's nicely presented because, like, it's an era we're familiar with because it's very similar to sort of the ATLA era. But it is an era where we don't know a ton about ultimately. So it is interesting the way some of it kind of, like, is presented, and so on. Like the section, like, there's a section on the Air Nomad genocide. All firebenders experienced a monumental increase in their ability. They killed all the air nomads, damaged their temples. The speed and efficiency stunned the world. When air nomad allies came to their aid, they were busy contending with the Fire Nation on other fronts, creating the perfect environment for Fire Lord's nefarious plans. So there's little details like that added in of, like, the Fire Nation effectively attacked with this, like, 8-pronged attack, in that they attacked all the temples at the same time and still had enough forces to, like, basically fend off, like, theoretically both water tribes trying to help and other people. Um, Again, there's not a ton of detail gone into, but that seems to be the way it's presented, is that the attack on the air nomads was, you know, brutal, but it was planned in a way where, like, they knew they would get aid, but they'd also counter that aid as well. Um, but what are the things that stand out to you, if anything, in this 100-Year War era section?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the way that they presented the ideas in this era, even though we do, we have a general idea of what actually happened. I think we're pretty interesting. Like, there's a couple parts where they have like specific stories about sort of, I guess, sort of the different tribes and sort of how they work during this era, or some that were hidden. Like, they have one about like a hidden water tribe settlement that was like in the caves. So there's sort of interesting parts like that, or they have a part about like some stories about like Too Young to Fight, which just sort of reminds me of sort of like, sort of the younger characters who are sort of like staying home to support, the water tribes, but some are still going out. So of course that sort of makes you think of sort of like Sokka and his sort of upbringing. They do a couple things where they have like some ideas and stories about sort of like the fire prisons, and of course they mention Hama in this section as well. So they focus on that, but they do it in a way that is more sort of general, because they do mention a lot of characters in this section that we do already know. But they sort of try to frame them in a way that's more, I guess, sort of general-ish, because we don't have any sort of like direct, I guess, sort of action in this era from anything that we've seen so far. But we do know like all these characters were around during this time. Like they mentioned, like Zhao, and of course Ozai's here, and like, so we know that these characters are around, that they're doing things, but they're trying to show you sort of like how you are like sort of like involved with these characters. So no, there's definitely like little tidbits here and there that make just the way that they present the information sort of interesting. They even mentioned like King Bumi and sort of how he's working during this time and how you might work with him, sort of like the technology. So I thought that the way that they actually decided to include him as sort of like someone who knows about the Avatar directly, even though everyone else during this era essentially like forgets about the Avatar, because they just have had no interaction with the Avatar during their lifetime. So it's interesting how they sort of, I guess, display and present those lines of information throughout this whole era, as well as how like you might interact with a character in this one. I think that might have been, despite the lore stuff being something that we probably know a bit about, even if we don't know any of the specific stories, but how to decide if you were to be like a Fire Nation player character in this era. I thought from just idea of how they would do this story, I thought that was interesting as well. So there definitely are some bits in here that are sort of like cool to read over, and just in terms of like we've mentioned before, like it's still a really good sort of like recap of this era. So like if you wanted to know about this information and didn't want to have to like dig through the episodes, it gets you up to speed really quick. So especially if you don't know anything at all, it definitely helps in that regard.
Yeah, and then stuff like that are obviously pieces of information I know everyone wants to know about. Like, you see important events, the Siege of Ba Sing Se, and it says the failed Siege of Ba Sing Se ended only 8 years ago and lasted a grueling 600 days. General Iroh, heir to the Fire Nation throne at the time, led the siege. The Fire Army got as far as breaching the outer wall and made their way through the agrarian zone around this time. Around this time, Iroh's son Liu Ten was badly injured in the assault and soon succumbed to his wounds. Suffering his son's death made Iroh realize that the siege cost too many lives and destroyed the morale of the soldiers. Iroh ended the siege, and eventually Ba Sing Se retook their lost ground and repaired the outer wall. So a tiny little bit of extra information there about like Liu Ten, that like he was injured in the assault and then died, and it wasn't that just like he was sort of like killed on the spot somewhere. So it's sort of like it's very like minor details, but it sort of creates the idea that like I guess he got to maybe like talk to Liu Ten before he died, and it wasn't just that there was like, he didn't get to say anything or anything like that at the end. So it's slowly building there, but not quite the full reveal as such. Things like that are kind of like interesting, where like you probably could have maybe gone a little bit more in depth there, but they didn't quite do it. And like there are other characters and stuff like that. Yeah, like oh god, this name, Mamguk Swaluk is the leader of a secret southern water tribe settlement, and that I guess maybe kind of like links into kind of some of the little information we learned in like what North and South about like there are other sections of the southern water tribe other than just the main area, and so on. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, and then like you say, like framing like characters we already know, but because it's in an era that we're only told about in the past, this is like Hama but right in the middle of what she's doing, effectively. So, you know, it's a few years before our characters, the ATLA characters, encounter her, but she's in the middle of doing what she's doing in that Fire Nation town. So, you know, all that stuff is kind of, you know, cool to see, even if it is kind of mostly. It's interesting in that the 100-Year War era is kind of effectively like the ATLA era, because Aang's era is more the kind of comic era more than anything. So it's a kind of cool distinction that they have. Have here, in that the Aang section is like all about like the comics, and that like the show is in the past. But here's where you can actually deal with the stuff from the show, but you have to do it without Aang and co really being involved for the most part. It's very interesting, the way it works, and this is where like maybe you wish like there was some new stuff, because otherwise it feels like you kind of almost have to approach it in a way where, well, you can't really do anything crazy, otherwise you maybe run the risk of like just repeating what Aang and co did in those episodes. But it's still, you know, interesting overall, and like this era definitely benefits from like the search, and the whole full details on what happened with like Azulon and stuff like that are out, and they can just openly describe that stuff, and that Urso was actually the one who did it, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, like you say, Zhao, the whole Wan Shi Tong stuff. Iroh, it's interesting in the section here, in that it kind of places a few things in order that you might not have fully known before. As a young man, he proved himself worthy of the dragons. So that sort of creates the idea that, like, okay, so him with the Ancient Sun Warriors was actually like somewhat early in his life. Then he kind of does the whole general thing.
Yeah.
The siege fails, and then they say he traveled the world for a long time, becoming a member of the White Lotus on his journey. So that's interesting, in that the White Lotus thing is post-death of his son rather than pre. In that, like, I almost would have done that almost like backwards, where like he's been in the White Lotus a lot of his life, but the dragon stuff only happens later. I don't know. It's interesting. And becoming the guide for his nephew and so on. So they don't mention his spirit world journey, do they here? Not really, but obviously we pretty much know the spirit world stuff has to be after the death of his son, because I actually think Legacy of the Fire Nation, I think, kind of said that. So it's
I think so, right?
It's weird in that, like, I suppose that's technically new in terms of the order for events in Iroh's life, but there's not really much that's like properly new.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
What else? Silent Rebellion. So it's kind of cool here. Like, the Fire Islands get a mention in this era. A few officers may act as benevolent rulers. Many are power-hungry warlords, exerting an iron fist over their population. The disconnect from the rules of the Fire Nation also means more room for people to rebel against unjust rule. So just that obvious thing of, like, you know, those early episodes of ATLA where we're basically traveling across the kind of faraway Fire Islands, and there doesn't seem to be as much Fire Nation influence, and you slowly get towards the capital. It's kind of what they go for there. And I think that is most of this era. It's unfortunate that it probably maybe has the least amount of new information, because this is the one that is so clearly like all the ATLA stuff just before ATLA happens. Is there anything like new kind of hidden in here that kind of stood out to you?
No, I think we went over most of what I had here in terms of stood out to me. I think the Iroh stuff was the last one that I had for me. That was just interesting, the order that they have that set up. But yeah, no, that's it for me in this section.
Yeah, I'm just looking here. Like, the Council of Five, I guess they name a few of the other ones, because like I think we only knew like a few of them, but now we get like General Yai Wen, General Qiu, and General Duanmu. So I suppose, you know, when they introduce a group of characters where there's only 5 of them, cool that we finally get the names. Um, which I suppose brings us to the Ang era, which, like I said before, is set immediately after Imbalance. And for the most part, what they do here is they just use effectively each of the comics as one of the themes of the era, which makes it a little bit like repetitive to go through if you're super familiar with the comics and have read them in a lot of detail, because there really isn't much new stuff at all. I get like again, it's for the game, and it's just meant to be the background information, and it's not really meant to have new stuff. But because the comics sort of like in a way ended at a point where it was very open, it kind of feels like kind of give us just a little bit more. Again, it's presented quite nicely. I appreciate the idea that like these comic characters are presented as like the notable figures for the era. Like the acolytes of this era. I like that you're mentioning like Jing Ying, Jingbo, and Yi Li as being, these are the main people apart from Aang that are members of the Air Nomads, the Air Nation during this era. They might seem like really like minor characters just from the comics, but in a few years, these are going to be like your leaders before you have other airbenders. And I like just the kind of it being presented like this as like a fact file kind of information, that it's like, oh yeah, these characters are going to go on to be important, even if like Jingbo feels like a really funny character at this point. But what stood out to you from how they presented the Aang era, which we're like super familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, that part definitely stood out to me in terms of, I don't know, how important those characters will be. Even, I think they do an interesting point of like characterizing them in those sections, just in terms of like how, I guess, sort of how important they are, or how, I guess, maybe devotional might be the word, in terms of just sort of air nomad sort of culture, and sort of keeping the history and sort of pushing it forward and finding out information without always having to bother Aang all the time for, you know, being essentially, you know, the only one that really, really knows how those things actually, you know, are going on. But yeah, no, I mean, I think in this section, they do mention there are some parts where they do, like, they don't actually continue ending on, but they do, you know, sort of, I guess, mention things that could be, I guess, in terms of plots for like future stories, either, you know, you playing the game or just sort of in general for the world. They do some stuff with sort of the Water Tribe in that regard. And I don't know, there are some parts here where they do mention, you know, characters that are essentially like new for the game. But they do, you know, add some interesting ideas in terms of how, I guess I have one here for like the Water Tribe, and sort of how how they would collect stories and protect sort of the history of the culture of the Southern Water Tribe, with, you know, everything that happened previously. So there are a couple parts like there. I think during this part, when I was reading it, it really made sense to me how it is more like an encyclopedia, which is something that we've mentioned before, which would be really cool to have in Avatar World, especially this section, since this is the section that we're sort of the most familiar with overall. So no, I think there definitely are some interesting parts here. Like, you have like an assassin character that I thought was pretty interesting that I made note of. So yeah, no, there's definitely some little bits in here that are fun as just a pure sort of read through. But, you know, again, you know, this is more sort of like familiarizing yourself with the era. So if you are super into it, like you said, it might not sort of be as interesting as the other sections, of course.
Yeah, and the Water Tribe section, there's like a recovering waterbending prisoners as like a sort of reference to Hama, that like she was one of those prisoners. What about the rest of them, and like where are they now a few years on? And they kind of mention that some of them will be elderly because of, again, look how old Hama was. So a lot of the waterbender prisoners, you know, are, I guess, out now, but they've been in prison for like who knows how long. Like that's an interesting concept, and I'd love to see that kind of explored, like um like next Avatar comic or something like that. Like introduce one of these returning other Southern Water Tribe waterbenders to kind of come back into things. That would be kind of nice. Um, but yeah, the Earth Kingdom stuff here is like you have Yudao, yeah, Toph, the Metal Bending Academy. Um, it's pretty, standard, of course. Like they mentioned, like Kyoshiwara, Suki, she knows chi blocking now. They do like mention like Sokka, who was briefly an honorary member. It's kind of cool. Um, Bending supremacists. So on, life in the lower ring of Ba Sing Se brought up again that that's still a problem, and it seems to sort of be a problem in basically every era. But yeah, there's that. The Fire Nation section, yeah, Zuko, Iroh is pretty obvious. Azula, I guess, is interesting because she's always the talking point about sort of where the comics have like stopped for now. So what it says about Azula is, after failing to defeat the Avatar and his allies with her father, Azula was institutionalized rather than imprisoned. As the fight pushed the princess to a breaking point, Zuko then withdrew Azula from the institution to search for their missing mother, Ursa. But Azula used the mission as a chance to try and kill her instead. After that, she disguised herself as a dark spirit in order to manipulate the new Ozai society into attacking Zuko, to make him strong, or so she claims. Despite everything that has happened, Azula may very well care for the welfare of her brother. Though their relationship remains tenuous, Azula still has the remaining fire warriors at her disposal. But she could choose to strike out on her own instead. Chances are she isn't far from Zuko, and she's unlikely to be willingly taken alive. So it's like, it basically just presents sort of, at the end of Smoke and Shadow, this is what Azula was up to. We're being sort of presented like, oh, she's doing this for this reason, but she still could cause chaos or some other direction. Not really making any specific statement that is like particularly interesting, but if you, I suppose, maybe have interpreted imbalance a certain way or another, it at least opens the door to the idea that, like, yeah, they're playing with the idea of she seems to be slowly getting towards understanding what she kind of needs to do. But I honestly didn't expect like massive Azula reveals from this, honestly. So there's that. Fire Warriors, of course, get a mention here. Satoru, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's more or less it for the Aang era. It is kind of unfortunate that it there's not a ton extra. Anything else to add on this era?
I did have mention in my notes of Azula. I think I have mention of, what's this character? One of the other, I guess it's this Fire Nation section that we're in. Yeah, one of the other characters I have mentioned that. I just thought that their story was sort of interesting in terms of what they could do, in terms of their, I guess, sort of moral compass being sort of one that's sort of trying to help things out, but was formerly a bad character. Don't know how to say their name. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that's pretty much it for me on this section here. I mean, it presents sort of the events that we sort of already know, and just sort of, gives us, I guess, sort of a solid blocking on sort of what has happened, which I guess for this section, that's pretty much what they were focusing on doing.
Yep. And that leads us to the last era, which is the Korra era. Again, like the previous section, they rely on the comics for the most part to set the sort of foundation for the era, but you can tell obviously that there's way less comics for this era than the other stuff. The dynamics, I think, are probably maybe like a little bit overall more interesting because they have like the Spear Portal in the Republic City to play with, so that creates an immediate story for the Airbenders. They play off the idea that for like the first time in the history, the Water Tribes are truly independent. The Southern Water Tribe finally has independence and their own leader, more than just like a tribal kind of leader. So that's all kind of cool. They play off the idea of like the Earth Kingdom for the first time in eons is changing, and it's maybe changing too quickly, which was the plot of like Ruins of the Empire. So there's all that sort of stuff. But like important events, it's like anti-bending revolution, Water Tribe civil war. Harmonic convergence does get mentioned here. There's no extra information on it, but just presenting the idea in a way that like, hey, if you want to say that harmonic convergence did something else, go ahead, sort of. So that's kind of cool. The Red Lotus, again, of course, gets mentioned. As like, ooh, other members of the Red Lotus may still be at large, which I don't feel is a massive plot point, because don't they really wrap this up at the end of book 3, where like Zuko, I think, is more or less says that like, yeah, we're going to deal with this. And I think at the start of like book 4, it's like more or less implied that it has been dealt with. But I suppose they're trying to create the idea of like basically have a remnants of the Earth Empire for the Red Lotus here. But there's that Earth Empire, Gao Crisis, which is Ruins of the Empire. Does anything from this Korra era, what's like the first thing that sort of stands out to you?
Let me see. So, I mean, I don't know. I think they do, like they've done in the past sections, they've done a good, job of like sort of characterizing the eras. I think sort of their breakdown of the Earth Kingdom, that stood out to me for some reason in terms of how, they're sort of characterizing it during this era here. I don't know. They do a little bit with, and I think we mentioned this earlier with sort of the dragons during this era. So that was interesting just to see how they were sort of bringing them up in this era here as well. They mentioned all of sort of like the characters that we know really well. So I guess it's interesting to see how they lead them towards, how you might interact with them in this game without, obviously giving anything away towards what their future sort of like history might, definitively be, like when they mention like sort of Kuvira, or they mention, Zuko later on, or even like General Iroh, and sort of like at odds with sort of what the Fire Nation is doing at home. But they do a good job of just sort of explaining sort of like how they're sort of like trying to make sure, they're not doing anything that they, sort of, realize their sort of militaristic past, but they're working towards sort of like, the future of the entire world in general. So, they do a lot of bit on mentioning that. And, they do mention, like, of course, there's like the whole section with the air nomads or Air Nation, and sort of how, that has changed over the times, and how they're, sort of, I guess, sort of interacting with the world and sort of the portal caretakers. So, there's just little bits here and there. I mean, I think this is, again, not the section where, we're getting anything like new or anything crazy like that. I think there's like one Fire Nation character that stood out to me as being new and unique. But other than that, I think for the most part, this section is sort of, it's pretty much what you've, grown to know and familiar with from watching the show and the comics as well.
Yeah, a little bit on Eska and Desna stood out to me in that they bring them up a bunch of times as sort of like they're young world leaders, because they're the like chiefs of the Northern Water Tribe, and that because they're on the right side after book 2, they're actually making good progress as the leaders of the Northern Water Tribe. And they bring up that like sort of young leaders is like one of the threats and challenges in a way. That people question them, but how will they handle themselves like if a proper significant like political situation comes up? They've done the basic stuff good so far, and they address that, how like they're helping to move the Northern Water Tribe to be more sort of accepting of different relationships and so on. But what if something bigger happens? What will they do? Because the Water Tribes have this amazing dynamic now, because they are independent, but they have this connection because the leaders of both tribes are part of the same family, and the family is on good terms now. So it's actually like a really positive dynamic, and they get across that like the South has never been in a better position than it is during this era, which is kind of cool to think about. You almost forget that, but just like I said earlier, like that initial paragraph describing the nation in each era, it's cool to see the progress between eras and how different it is. Um,
Yeah.
we also have, Earth Kingdom is pretty self-explanatory. Kuvira, and it's just like, if you want to go on a mission with Kuvira, you'll have to watch out for her, basically, is kind of what they say. The Fire Nation section, I was interested because, to me, this is like the equivalent of like it should be the equivalent of like the Air Nomad section for Kyoshi, where we know very little about this, because we don't go there in Korra, we barely reference it. Izumi only has like a handful of lines of dialogue. And because there's not a lot new, it feels kind of like new and interesting, but you can sort of tell it's based on only like a few tiny pieces of information. Like, Fire Lord Izumi is famous for her efforts to reform the Fire Nation's government and cultivate peaceful relationships with the other nations, including the United Republic of Nations. Her father Zuko shares her eagerness to continue moving away from the Fire Nation's brutal past. Izumi is calm, rational, and steadfast, making decisions on behalf of the Fire Nation that not only take its well-being in mind, but the well-being of the rest of the world. She has little tolerance for jokes or levity in serious discussions, as she's determined to treat important decisions with the respect they deserve. Heroes may want to go to her and conduct themselves with integrity. So it's like, okay, a little bit of extra, but I think we basically got that characterization from her unwillingness to like want to involve the Fire Nation military in things. Zuko, of course, like always, kind of fascinating here. They don't again give too much extra information, at least in his like initial section here. I find it interesting that like I was looking really laser focused. Like, are they going to mention the daughter, Izumi's daughter? Finally sort of properly canonize that.
Yeah.
But they don't. But I also don't feel like any of the wording here like rules out the possibility that like she does have another child. Because I think it was always the idea that Iroh was older than this daughter character. So with Iroh, the new stuff is that they sort of address a couple of times the idea that how does his military career impact the fact that he's technically like the crown prince of the Fire Nation? And they create this cool dynamic of like, no one knows if like he will, want to lead the Fire Nation in the future, or if he'll stick with the military career. Because Iroh, he has such scattered appearances in the series, you almost forget how important he is just in the world. So I like that. His description kind of really helps to be like, I'm keeping my eye on this character, whereas he almost fades into the background sometimes for me a little bit. So it makes him feel more important for sure. The section on dragons you mentioned is interesting because this has one of the more interesting new pieces of information in the book. So legend has it that dragons were the first firebenders. Now, there are only 3 known dragons left in the world, and Zuko has met them all. When he was a teenager, he befriended Ran and Shaw on the Sun Warrior Island. In his 20s, he found a juvenile dragon he named Druk, who shared an ancestry with Ran and Shaw. Over the years, Druk grew up and became Zuko's loyal companion, and the two of them flew around the world together. There are people out there who specifically like to hunt rare, majestic animals. If they take risks to capture sky bison, they almost will be certainly willing to take big risks to capture a dragon. Additionally, conservationists may want to search the wilderness for possible undocumented dragons. So it creates the dynamic here of like, one, everyone's been asking about where did this character come from? Because I think even when we first learned about Druk, we were all baffled that they did nothing to explain this dragon existing at all. So this is the first time they've officially said anything about where Zuko got Druk from. So Zuko's in his 20s and he finds effectively a teenage dragon. Now, does this disconnect the whole Druk thing from the Ancient Sun Warrior egg? Maybe, but it probably also links in a little bit more in that if he found it in his 20s, that means like 10 years ago, he touched an egg that sort of activated. And then 10 years later, he encountered a young dragon who bonded with him. There's still the option of that, like, Sun Warrior artifact being a dragon egg and there being that connection to that scene. But then they open up the idea that there are probably other dragons out there as well. So I don't really know what to make of that. Is that just sort of opening the door if you want to tell stories that involve dragons? Or canonically, are there more than 3 dragons? I'd say just for the sake of the future, there probably has to be at least 1 or 2 more dragons, but we'll see where they go. What was your take on this? Because I was expecting this book to feature a lot of little pieces of new information like that. Never heard about before, that Zuko in his 20s found the dragon. But this is one of the only significant tiny pieces of information in the whole book. So what are your thoughts on what they do here with the dragons?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I like the idea of it. Like, I like the idea that, he could be, traveling around and he finds, another dragon, and that's sort of, how it works, and that's, his animal companion essentially. So, like, the idea, the motif of that, it works, it fits within the world. It definitely would have been, I don't know, maybe it would have been cool to have a bit more information on that, but of course this isn't really sort of the media where you would get that sort of information. But I guess in a sense it does, set up the platform for that to actually happen and for that to be expanded upon later on. And yeah, it did feel like this is sort of like the little tidbit of information that we might have expected to have a bit more of. But I know it seems like, which probably just because of sense of just keeping everything in line, it makes sense to not sort of like go super crazy with the little extra bits of stories, even though that's sort of what us particularly are looking forward towards from these particular sort of stories that they have out of this book here. So I don't know, I mean, I think it works. I mean, if the fact that there are more dragons out there, that wouldn't really surprise me, and they're setting up this whole, idea of this is what you could go out and look for on your adventures. So I mean, I don't know. It works in terms of what they're doing here, and it would have been nice if there was a little bit more, but that's not particularly their focus, I guess.
Yeah, and then I suppose just as a piece of information, it's also kind of like, oh, so I suppose that ruins the idea that like we get to see sort of Zuko with like a little baby dragon in like his late teens or something like that. If like he really did see like Druk hatch and like had him since he was like super young, but instead they seem to get across the idea that like Druk was actually relatively grown by the time he found him. So, I don't know. I still really like that idea of just Zuko with this tiny dragon, not having a clue how to like train it or anything like that. But they obviously seem to work around it with this one. But yeah, it's definitely a cool idea. The Air Nomad section is pretty standard and to the point here. And then like you said, the only like new character they talk about here is Dalja Ro, the head of a special force dedicated to helping when a disaster strikes, and they just kind of get across that this character is there's a few things here, like they I think this is a non-binary character, and also they often recruit graduates from the Royal Fire Academy for Girls, where they went to school. During their time at the academy, Dalja realized they didn't truly feel like a girl, and the support of their classmates helped to shape Dalja into the person they are today. They remain an admiral in the Fire Navy, but the Fire Nation has committed to funding the relief fleet. It is interesting that like they really slowed down for the most part in these later eras with doing too much with new characters, which makes sense, but it also means there's not too much that is new. I think that's mostly it. Again, like we'll have time to read through it more and come back and do more focused discussions later. How much more in terms of the rest of the book have you actually like kind of like read through at all? Because there's the adventure hook section later on, which is basically like a paragraph for a potential story that you could do, which for the most part doesn't have too much information. It maybe names a new character without explaining who they are. And I think there's stuff like, say, I think they named like a new triad in the chorus section. Scarlet Sword Triad gets a mention in the chorus section. There's tiny scattered pieces of information, but you sort of question, like, is this section canon or not? Because it's not in the settings section. um, and stuff like that. There's a full adventure right at the end, which is set in Aang's era, which I definitely, this is something I need to go into in a lot more depth, because I'm guessing the concept of this story for the adventure is meant to be canonical in terms of what actually happens. Um, but it again, it's kind of relatively unclear. But I assume quite a bit of writing had to go into creating this story, and like it includes and full on NPCs. Like the cabbage merchant is an NPC in this one. There's a character named Rose, and so on. And like, are these just made up characters, or because they have a like description of who they are they canon to that era? So, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how much more have you read, and your thoughts on some of these other sections that kind of have story?
Yeah, no, I've looked at some of the other parts. I think the part that I looked at the most was sort of the other NPC characters, just to see sort of what they might do with them. I didn't get too deep into the adventure hooks, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess this is probably like the hard part of how we're sort of looking at this book, is in terms of like, what are we considering stuff that really fits in with the whole overall storyline and things, and which ones are more towards just, making sure that this game is enjoyable to play, and that you have like ideas of what to do and what sort of stories to make up, and how your player characters are going to interact with this world that you're sort of thinking up of on the fly. So that part definitely is, I guess, a bit hard from where we're looking at it from. I mean, if you're playing the game, it doesn't really matter that much. You're just sort of trying to have fun with it. But yeah, I mean, I think, regardless, there's definitely a lot here that's like interesting to just like explore in terms of just like thought ideas in general. So yeah, no, there's definitely a lot in here, and I definitely have not gotten through all of it yet.
Yeah, and then like there's some fun stuff, like just looking through like some of the like technique names is kind of interesting. Uh, the description of the techniques is purely sort of like game mechanics, like they don't try to give it sort of like any sort of a this is what this technique looks like in reality or anything like that. So there's not too much to read into like there at all. There's the NPCs at the end, including the 5 legend NPCs. So we get like Kyoshi, Roku, and Korra, and Iroh, and there'll be more of these in the other book, the Wan Shi Tong Adventure Guide. Again, they're kind of just like a quote for the character, a picture of the character. Here's how you should play this character in terms of like, I suppose the GM would be playing these characters if you use them in your story. Bring them in these type of stories, and they get 3 techniques each. Probably the most interesting part of this is that they give Roku a lava technique, even though from what I've read, there's no real like mechanic for how to use the avatar state as such. So maybe that is some sort of implication that Roku is just naturally a lava bender, which we don't know for sure, because there's obviously some weirdness around some of those special bending techniques. Other than that, the only thing I'd say is just that the image for Aang and Korra, their Legend NPC pages, is new stock imagery, and I think it looks really, really cool. Like that Aang image with Momo looks very clean, and I think Korra looks awesome in her kind of book 4 outfit as like the last image in the book. But other than that, that is basically everything. But again, when the adventure guide comes out, which I think the implication on what they've said about that in terms of its progress is that we're maybe only like a month, a little bit over that, away from maybe getting that one as well, because it's going through its last approval stages. They'll have to set up the PDF and go through the same process here, but it doesn't seem like we're too off from getting that one as well. And they have said that there's new Wan Shi Tong information on that. So I'm very interested to see how that book looks, because I doubt they'll just have the same chapters. So is it just going to be like a small settings chapter that has like Wan Shi Tong information or what in it? But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? Like how they'll do the second book, given that they've said there will be new kind of canon info?
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if it's going to be as, more clear cut as this one is, or if it's going to have to be read through a bit more, and we're looking more for sort of like your tidbits and stuff like that. Because I mean, I don't know. It seems like it might be more long form. I don't know. I'm not really sure on
Hmm.
that.
So there's that, and then that book will also have like more like adventures, so like more kind of fleshed out ideas for stories as well. So there might be some canon stuff to read into with the NPCs that are included in those stories, especially if there's a Roku era story, like where they've gone done a little bit more detail on that stuff. So some of those NPC stuff is important to go through, which is why like I think it's very difficult to like do a really detailed analysis of all the new information, because there's the clear cut chapter 2, the settings chapter, and the like 80-ish pages it's made up of, but there's also some new info in like the bending section which I referenced, the adventure section, and so on. So
Mhm.
it's pretty cool. I like it. I'm it's made me really excited to get the physical book when they actually start shipping them out, because I like reading through this. Like, obviously, I'm complaining a little bit that like it doesn't have this information, doesn't have that information, but I like having this sort of reference material to hand. In that it feels like sort of it's a kind of like an Avatar wiki in a book. Most of the information, which is pretty nice, and it is encyclopedia esque in what it does. So that's just going to be exciting to have, especially like given like at least at the tier I went in, I have the special cover and that's going to be like shiny and stuff like that, and all the extra bits that are going to be part of that. Um, but yeah, I suppose just what are your kind of like final thoughts overall? Like we kind of went into this not having a amazing idea about what information there will be, won't be. How did it meet your expectations?
I think it pretty much met my expectations as is. Like, I don't think I was like overly hopeful for anything, but not really like, thinking that it wasn't going to be like anything at all. So I don't know. I think it's pretty much met me sort of like on the level because I didn't really have any sort of like
Hmm.
over like exaggerated expectations of like we're gonna get like a whole new, like a whole new like basically like mini story on whatever specific era. But it definitely surprised me in some places. I think for a lot of people the Roku era stuff was probably the most sort of like impactful thing, and just for checking out this type of book for, I guess, pretty much my first time. I think I've seen some other role playing books, but I've never looked into them in any sort of detail because I didn't really have interest in those worlds. I think, for that whole sort of experience, I think it worked pretty well for me. I mean, it definitely, seems like it would be, a fun game for people to play, and it definitely gives you a lot of information on how to actually run the game if you're planning to do so.
Yeah, like obviously I'm mainly like reviewing this from the lore perspective, because I think after reading through the quick start, it became sort of clear it's not really for me. I don't think I'm just into the RPG style games like that too much. But in terms of the lore, I would say the Roku stuff over delivered compared to what I was expecting. I didn't think we get as much of this to be as like interconnected and as interesting as it actually was. But I'd say I think the other eras it probably under delivered, in that like I was expecting a couple more little bits like the Zuko found Rook when he was in his 20s style information. I think what we actually got was a little bit too like minimal on the new stuff, to where it feels like there's a kind of gulf between like the Aang era just references the comics, and then Roku's era has this like interconnected sort of like political kind of plot style thing, which is fine. Like you have to play off some of the stuff from the comics in the Aang era, but just expected a little bit more. It does make me very excited though for whenever they start up. I guess it will probably be another Kickstarter for the supplementary books on Republic City, and especially the Spirit World, which I guess will have its own settings chapter of sorts. Because if you're going to play in the Spirit World and have more spirit characters, you probably do have to go over how to characterize spirits, which I don't even think a lot of the writers have done incredibly well in some of their appearances in regards to like the chorus spirits. So I think they could do some really cool stuff with regards to that, and sort of getting into more of the spirit world mechanics, what spirits are like in general. Maybe classifying spirits a little bit would be kind of cool. Just that sort of depth, and kind of, is there spirit politics? Like, are there leaders of the spirits and so on? I'm excited to get there, if there is going to be new information in them, of course. Like, I'm guessing the Republic City one will mainly be like triads and politics, depending on where it's set. But yeah, I'm in general like pleased with this overall, because the Roku stuff is very, very good. They said there was new information, there was, and it was well beyond what I thought it would be. So I'm happy they did what they said they'd do. It just makes it feel like I'd like a little bit more of this in the other sections, but it's fine. So yeah, we'll come back to this. We'll do more discussions as we have more time to read it, because like I've only had it 3 days. I think you've only had it like 2, and it's like a 300-page book. 200 of those pages are just playing the game, but you kind of have to take a look through everything to find everything. So it's going to be quite a while. So it's kind of cool. It's cool. But yeah, that's been the show for today. It's obviously going to be tough to see like where other news comes from. Like I said, the adventure guide may come at some point over the next few weeks. We'll definitely discuss that if there is anything to discuss. We'll probably come back and do a sort of follow-up to this with more focused thoughts. But other than that, we are kind of just waiting for like preview pages for comics and bigger announcements to happen, and set up for maybe Comic-Con to have big info. But other than that, that has been episode 238 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.